大家现在收看的是华尔街电视的思想新知报节目啊。今天我继续向李杰博士访问一些问题。估计这几天大家已经看到了中国的一个小公司啊 ，Deepseek 啊，或者是我们翻译成中文深度探索啊，对这个美国科技界啊、教育界啊、投资界的这样一次震撼啊，可以说是用恐慌来形容啊，并不为故。但是对于我们思想新知报的观众来讲啊，没有那么惊讶啊。有一些观众，有一些朋友这几天就跟我说，实际上很多的问题我们在过去几年中间的思想新知报啊，已经做了很多的这种介绍或者是讨论。今天中国的一个小公司的出现，对我们来讲啊，并不是令人惊讶的事情。但是这一次的事件会产生什么样的后果？是不是意味着啊，硅谷的啊人工智能的神话，至少第一季啊已经结束了啊？我们现在是不是真的迎来第二季？还是说第一季的一个收尾啊，一个最好的一幕？但是华尔街的市场的这种恐慌，这一场狂跌啊，哪一些事情是理性的，哪一些事情是不理性的啊？那么这需要一些比较专业的分析，因为需要讨论的问题很多。那今天的第一个问题，我主要是想请教一下李奇博士啊，你觉得英伟达的这一家公司在这样一个啊中国的大大提升了它的效能啊，大大的啊节省了它的这个算力，所以市场上恐慌的认为这个意味着英伟达这样一个芯片公司会受到非常沉重的这个打击啊，因为市面上不需要这么多的这个芯片。但是李奇博士在早几天就给我发信息来，他认为呢市场对英伟达的这个判断呢恰恰是犯了非常大的这个错误当这个人工智能更加平民化、更加民主化之后，实际上算力呢是需求更大。请教一下李奇博士你能不能比较详细的把你的思考、你的观察跟大家展现一下？
感谢和平先生的提问。首先呢，今天早上我也看到了很多这个今日华尔街频道的观众朋友们在之前其实将近1个月之前我们那一期节目底下告诉我们，原来你们早就注意到 Deepseek 这一家公司了。那么看来今天市场的反应又有点慢半拍。当然，大家可能更注重的一个问题是，这一次市场是不是反应过激了我们看到召集市值一夜之间抹去，特别是像英伟达这样的算力芯片巨头，更是损失惨重。到底是市场反应过度了，还是英伟达真的就没有那么值钱呢？这个问题其实现在不仅仅是我们关注也是很多的我们叫做华尔街技术分析师也好，包括科技企业的投资人正在关注的一个问题。那我们首先在回答和平先生这个问题之前先跟大家讲一讲这个 Deepseek 的创新程度到底有多大意义。我也特别注意到现在网友也是分成了2派一派呢就是认为 Deepseek 问题非常大。为什么呢？你只要问他习近平，他就过左右而言他，说咱们聊点别的吧。你说这样的一个模型怎么可能在国际上有市场竞争力呢？这是一种观点当然另外一派观点主要是技术员，特别是尝试了 R1 这样的一个思维模式展现之后，已经是惊讶到五体投地。所以有人说这一次有关于 Deepseek 的创新到底有多大意义，其实是文理2派之争这当然也是简单化的这样的一个说法。那我今天呢简单跟大家讲一讲这个 Deepseek 的创新到底在哪里因为这个我们就说不用非常复杂的专业术语讲吧首先我们就看到就是说 Deepseek 是不是简单套壳或者叫蒸馏了一个美国的大语言模型？其实并不是的。之前很多的中国模型相当于是类似于是套壳这一种而 Deepseek 呢它不是 直接从美国那儿扒来的一个模型，这一点我们首先必须要说。但是是不是这个 Deepseek 花600万做出了这个 OpenAI 花了这个1000亿做出的这样的一个结果呢？实际上也不能这样的说为什么呢？因为第一是站在巨人的肩膀上，第二就是说它的主要的创新和突破呀，实际上是在技术层面或者我们叫做工程层面的突破，而不是真的是就是说彻底解决了这个英伟达芯片的这个瓶颈等等等等。那么到底是怎样的一个整合呢？大家可能听说是基于 Transformer 架构这样的一个结合。那么具体而言是分布，就有几个步骤首先是 MOE， 那我们知道激活了一部分参数，大幅度的提升了推理的效率。这点之前我们在节目中也为大家介绍到混合专家模型，还有就是之前为大家讲到的就是 MLA 叫做多头潜在注意力，实际上就是说是对于传统的注意力机制是一个新的进展。那么呢可以显著的降低内存以及计算的开销。还有我们就是长链推理，那如果你是做这个领域的话，要知道把这个复杂任务的逻辑进行拆解，同时呢提升了这个多路径的推理能力。还有就是双重流水线，相当于是减少了计算资源的闲置时间，对于硬件的利用率有所提高。还有就是之前我们说的这个 FP8 混合精度训练，节省计算资源等等等等。所以实际上是一系列的很小的这样的一种我们叫做这个对于计算资源的节省再加上复杂任务的优化拆解，大大的降低了内存的开销降低了计算的开销，所以最后导致的结果就是它的训练成本只有 Meta 只有这个 OpenAI 的很小的一部分。有很多的这个浪费性的或者叫做不优化性的这样的一部分成本就给节省掉了所以呢我们就说简单的把它说成是伟大的创新突破比肩 OpenAI， 或者是简单的说就是从美国那儿套壳一个模型，其实都不是这样的。换句话说说整个的这一次 Deepseek 的胜利呢，其实不仅仅是一家企业的胜利，说它是整个中国 AI 界的胜利，我觉得也不太恰当。本质上来讲是开源模式的这样的一个胜利。而现在呢 Deepseek 可以说是充分利用了开源技术力量的本身，也成为了整个开源力量的一部分。那么有关于这个 Deepseek 到底是不是代表着未来的某一些方向，现在呢其实业内人士是有一个比较清晰的这样的一个结论，就是它的确是展现了开源模式的很大的潜力。那么未来可能我们也发现技术效率的提升会对于整个 AI 的民主化有着非常革命性的意义。这就要说到何明先生的问题了，现在市场的这个反应是不是过激了？那我们看到这个市场为什么会产生信心动摇土崩瓦解式的崩盘呢？就是很多大型企业在 AI 上投入的这个资金规模可怕到几乎是到了某一个国家这样一国政府预算的这样的一个级别1000亿甚至是上兆。但实际上市场一直有一个疑问，就是说你的这个成本到底是吹大的泡沫，还是真的就需要这么多成本？产生的回报到底和这个投资之间是不是相匹配？现在看来整个市场的信心已经是天崩地裂，整个欧美科技股市蒸发已经是超过了1兆美元这还仅仅是一天。那么呢不仅仅是美股的期货、纳斯达克100指数、半导体股盘、美元指数一直可以说是从今天早上刚刚破晓开始就是一路狂跌，整个市场的避险情绪可以说是已经加顶。今天趁这个机会我们特别为大家也介绍一个经济学上的一个理论是什么呢？就是著名的杰文斯悖论。什么叫做杰文斯悖论呢？我们先讲一讲这个杰文斯是谁？他呢是19世纪的英国的一位经济学家全名叫做威廉杰文斯。他写了一本书叫做《煤矿问题》是在1860几年写的。我们一听这是一本古书了。他要讲的一个问题是什么呢？就是说蒸汽机效率 提升了这个大大提升啊，降低了煤炭的使用成本。按理说有了蒸汽机之后，是不是大家就不用煤炭了呀？不对，反而导致了煤炭需求总量的增加。为什么呢？因为第一，更高效的技术让单位成本下降了，所以这个资源的使用就变得更加经济了。成本一下降，效率一提升，结果市场需求就增大了，更多的人使用这个资源，反而是加剧了整体的消耗。后来大家就用这个杰芬斯悖论来指代什么呢？就是说技术进步提高了资源的利用效率，但是反而导致资源的总消耗量增加了。那我们举一个例子比如说你家里有节能电灯泡，那本来呢你是要减少能源消耗的，但是节能电灯泡价格低了，更耐用了，大家可能原来省电，现在就没那么省电了，结果整体的这个能源消耗未必减少。没有节能灯泡的时候，或许你嫌电费贵每天这个该关灯就关灯随手关灯。但是有了节能灯了，无所谓了，电这么便宜，那我就一直开着呗，不关电脑了也不关电视了，结果整体的能源消耗反而增大了。再比如说什么呢？就是说这个汽车发动机汽车发动机效率提升了，那么单位燃油的行驶里程更长了，但是你到底是燃油总需求上升还是下降呢？大家觉得效率提升之后，燃油需求是不是应该下降但是不一定因为现在驾驶更多的里程反而更加的便宜了。原来我要走路，原来我要坐公共交通，现在我干脆驾车去了，结果导致燃油的总需求就上升了。到这个数据存储和计算其实也是这样。那比如说这个云计算数据压缩技术，存储效率提高了，降低了成本。大家是不是对于数据存储的需求就降低了呢？不一定，反而可能因为成本低，导致数据存储的需求增加，最后反而是导致整个数据中心的总能耗上升了。这个和英伟达有什么关系呢？其实现在英伟达也有可能会出现新的杰文斯悖论这样的一个情况。为什么呢？因为我们看到不管是 Deepseek 也好，还是中国所谓白菜价的模型一系列不管是豆包也好，还是 Kimi 也好，可能大家都会看到一系列的动作。现在整个的这个 AI 的这个成本下降的速度是相当快的。目前我们看到有分析说是每1年半每18个月下降90%以上。但是随着计算成本下降了， AI 的消费量就会大幅的增加。因此我们看到这个计算需求不一定是下降的，反而有可能是增加的。当然我们说到未来，可能推理计算的需求要占到大头这个会超过训练计算的需求。那么现在的这个芯片资源是过剩了，还是难以满足需求呢？很有可能是难以满足需求，就是所谓杰文斯悖论，整个行业可能需要更多的芯片资本的支出。那我们也看到，目前这个英伟达的 GPU 在整个的这个推理市场中，大概是占到了80%左右的一个份额。那未来不管是定制芯片的这样的一个趋势不断涌现还是其他的这个市场竞争者加入等等等等，这个比例有可能会下降，但是并不意味着算力成本下降，对于 AI 芯片的需求也会下降。因此从这个情况来看我目前看到，其实对于英伟达这个股票急剧抛售一个抹掉的市值已经超过了墨西哥整个市场的规模这呢可能更多的是市场不太理性的一个反应。当然我们也说市场不理性，这也不是第一次了就像之前大家没有关注到 Deepseek 一样，今天的这个反应也有可能有过激之嫌。那我们分析的到底对不对呢？或许未来的几天我们就会看到更多更详尽的答案了。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的突发事件节目。今天我们要聊的是一个激动人心的话题 ，Deepseek 的 Genus Pro AI 模型。 这个中国初创企业最新发布的开源 AI 模型，不仅在图像生成方面超越了竞争对手，还成功的击败了稳定性 AI 和微软支持的 OpenAI 的模型。根据技术报告，Genus Pro 7B 在基于文本提示的图像生成排行榜中，表现远超 OpenAI 的 DALL-E 3和稳定性 AI 的 Stable Diffusion。这款新模型是 Deepseek 在去年推出的 Genus 模型的升级版，并且在推出新助手 Deepseek V3 后，该助手已经成为美国 App Store 上评价最高的免费应用程序。根据报告的改进包括升级训练过程、数据质量和模型大小，这使得它在图像稳定性和细节丰富度上有了显著提升。此外 ，Genus Pro 还通过增加7200万张高质量合成图像，并与现实世界数据进行平衡，实现了更具视觉吸引力和稳定性的图像输出。该模型的版本拥有高达70亿个参数，显著提高了文本到图像生成和任务理解的训练速度及准确性。请大家继续收看详细内容。欢迎收看突发事件特别节目，我是你的主持人。今天我们将深入探讨一项在人工智能领域引起广泛关注的重要进展。这篇报道来自路透社，文章介绍了一家中国初创企业 Deepseek 发布的新型开源人工智能模型 Genus Pro 7B。该模型在图像生成能力的基准测试中超越了竞争对手，特别是 OpenAI 的 DALL-E 3和 Stability AI 的 Stable Diffusion。首先，让我们详细了解这篇报道的内容。Deepseek 公司在最新发布的技术报告中透露，他们的新模型 Genus Pro 7B 在基于文本提示的图像生成排行榜中胜过了 OpenAI 和 Stability AI 的产品。这款新模型是对去年底推出的 Genus 模型的升级版，紧随其后的是基于 Deepseek V3 模型的新助手的推出。该助手已成为美国苹果应用商店中评分最高的免费应用。技术报告指出，新模型通过改进训练过程，提高数据质量和扩大模型规模，实现了图像生成的稳定性和细节的丰富性。Genus Pro 通过新增7200万张高质量的合成图像，并将其与真实世界数据进行平衡，达到了更吸引眼球和更稳定的图像输出。此外，该公司提到 ，Genus Pro 的更大版本模型拥有多达70亿个参数，提高了文字到图像生成的训练速度和准确性及任务理解能力。在了解了这个模型的基本信息后，让我们尝试从多个角度对其进行分析和评论。首先，从技术角度来看 ，Genus Pro 7B 模型在数据质量和模型规模上的提升，是其在图像生成方面表现出色的关键。增加高质量的合成图像库，并将其与真实世界的数据进行平衡，显然是为了增强模型在处理复杂图像生成任务时的适应性和准确性。模型参数的增加也意味着在处理能力和学习深度上的显著提升，为生成更复杂和精细的图像奠定了基础。从商业角度而言 ，Deepseek 能够在竞争激烈的 AI 市场中脱颖而出，特别是在图像生成领域超越微软支持的 OpenAI 和 Stability AI 的产品，标志着中国初创企业在全球科技竞争中的重要位置。通过开源的方式发布模型 ，Deepseek 不仅展现了其技术实力，也可能在吸引开发者、社群及推动技术广泛应用方面打下坚实基础。这种策略可能会进一步推动其市场影响力，吸引更多投资和合作机会。此外，值得注意的是，随着 AI 技术的发展，其潜在的社会影响也愈发明显。图像生成技术的进步可能会对艺术、设计、广告等多个行业产生颠覆性影响。企业和个人可以利用这些技术生成高质量的图像，从而降低生产成本，提高生产效率。然而，这也带来了版权、隐私和伦理等方面的挑战。如何在推进技术发展的同时，确保这些技术的合理使用，避免侵权和不当使用，将是 Deepseek 及其他类似企业需要面对的重要问题。从更广泛的社会视角来看，这项技术的进步再次强调了 AI 在日常生活中日益增长的作用。无论是通过手机应用程序，还是专业的创意工具 ，AI 生成的图像和其他内容正逐渐成为我们生活的一部分。随着技术的成熟，普通用户和专业人士使用 AI 工具的门槛将进一步降低，这可能会激发更多创新和创意，也可能重塑我们看待和体验视觉艺术的方式。最后，从政策和监管的角度考虑，随着 AI 技术的迅速发展和广泛应用，制定相关法规和政策以规范其使用显得尤为迫切。 政府和行业组织需要共同制定标准，以确保这些技术的透明度和责任性。开放源代码模型的推出，同样需要在知识产权和使用规约上进行仔细的审查和规范。总的来看 ，Deepseek 的 Genus Pro 7B 模型不仅代表了技术的一次重要飞跃，也开启了关于 AI 技术未来发展的众多讨论。它展示了中国科技企业在全球创新舞台上的崭露头角，以及 AI 技术在商业和社会中的广泛应用潜力。同时，它也提醒我们在享受技术带来的便利和效率时，不可忽视其可能带来的复杂挑战和责任。感谢您收看今天的节目，我们将继续关注这一领域的最新动态，期待与大家分享更多深入的分析和见解。下次节目再会。在这个瞬息万变的科技时代，一家名为 Deepseek 的中国人工智慧公司以迅雷不及掩耳之势，迅速闯入公众视野。这家初创公司最新推出的多模态 AI 模型家族，名为 Genus Pro， 被其宣称能够超越 OpenAI 的DALL-E 3。据 TechCrunch 报道，Genus Pro 模型家族的参数数量从10亿到70亿不等，参数的多寡大致上反映出模型解决问题的能力。因此，拥有更多参数的模型通常比参数较少的模型表现更佳。这次的发布无疑让 AI 界再次掀起一波热潮。Genus Pro 在 Hugging Face 上以 MIT 许可证开放下载，这意味着它可以在商业上无限制使用。这一系列的模型被描述为新颖的自回归框架，能够分析及创建新图像。根据公司声称 ，Genus Pro 在2项 AI 评估基准 GenEval 和 DPG Bench 上表现优异。最大的 Genus Pro 7B 模型不仅超越了DALL-E 3，还击败了其他几款模型，如 Pazart Alpha、Emu 3 Gen 以及 Stability AI 的 Stable Diffusion XL。虽然这些模型中有些年代已久，且 Genus Pro 只能分析和生成解析度高达 384x384 的小图像，但考虑到模型的紧凑尺寸， Genus Pro 家族的表现仍然令人印象深刻。Deepseek 在 Hugging Face 上的贴文中写道 ，Genus Pro 超越了先前的统一模型，并匹配或超越了任务专用模型的性能。Genus Pro 的简单性、高灵活性和有效性，使其成为下一代统一多模态模型的强劲候选者。这家由量化交易公司高飞资本管理公司 Highflyer Capital Management 主要资助的中国 AI 实验室，因其聊天机器人应用程序在苹果应用商店排行榜上名列前茅，迅速进入主流意识。Verge 进一步报道指出 ，Deepseek 的语言模型因其计算效率高的训练技术，让许多华尔街分析师和技术专家开始质疑美国是否能继续在 AI 竞赛中保持领先地位，以及 AI 晶片需求是否会持续。Deepseek 的新模型 Genus Pro 被认为能够超越 Stable Diffusion 和DALL-E 3，这一说法无疑为已经在应用商店排行榜上掀起波澜的 R1 推理 AI 再添一把火。Deepseek 的推出不仅是一个技术上的突破，更是对全球 AI 市场格局的挑战。Genus Pro 的出现不仅展示了中国 AI 技术，谢谢大家收看六度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是六度 World。请介绍给你的亲朋好友。 大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。在今天的节目中，我们将深入探讨中国初创科技公司 Deepseek 的崛起对美中科技战的影响，以及这场人才竞赛的背后意义。专家指出， Deepseek 的成功揭示了美国小院高离战略的局限性，并挑战了美国在人工智慧领域的主导地位。这家位于杭州的研究实验室，最近在中美应用商店的下载排行中超越了 ChatGPT， 并引发了美国投资者的警觉，导致纳斯达克指数大幅下跌。Deepseek 的最新大型语言模型 R1 在性能上与 OpenAI 的模型不相上下，这让业界感到震惊。尽管中国在高科技领域仍有很长的路要走，但 Deepseek 的崛起显示了其在 AI 领域的潜力与效率。中国科技公司在人才和资源方面的竞争越演越烈，显示出两国在高科技领域的全规模竞争已经展开。此外，美国对中国高科技产品的出口限制也让中国科技创新面临压力。然而，这些限制是否会适得其反，推动中国技术的进一步发展呢？ Deepseek 的成功是否会成为中国在全球 AI 舞台上的转折点？这些问题都将在我们的讨论中一一揭晓。请大家继续收看详细内容。在科技的竞赛中，中美两国间的角力不断升温，而一间名不见经传的中国科技创业公司 Deepseek 的崛起，正如同一颗重磅炸弹，揭示了美国限制中国技术进步的策略漏洞。这家公司位于杭州，最近在中国和美国的应用商店中名列下载排行榜的首位，甚至超过了在美国的 ChatGPT， 让人惊讶不已。Deepseek 的成功背后是由一群主要来自中国大学的毕业生组成的团队，他们在今年1月20日发布了最新的大型语言模型 LLM R1， 其性能可与 OpenAI 的 O1 系列相媲美。LLM 是预先训练于大量数据之上的大型深度学习模型，是生成式人工智能服务的基础技术，比如 ChatGPT。 美国南加州大学的法律教授 Angela Zhang 指出 ，Deepseek 的成功凸显了美国出口限制的局限性。他认为，美国的小院高墙策略可能在短期内有效，但长期来看却可能刺激中国的创新。而在中国的社交媒体上，北京日报旗下的账号长安街知识也发表了一篇社论，毫不含糊地表示，这一案例对那些企图通过孤立来维持技术优势的人施加了一记响亮的耳光。尽管文中未点名美国，但一纸不言自明。同样的，民族主义评论员胡锡进也指出 ，Deepseek 的崛起让人逐渐看清年轻人才的真正避风港究竟在哪里。美国一直以来对中国的高科技产品设限，从2022年开始，更是对向中国出口高性能计算芯片进行严格控制，比如 NVIDIA 的 A100 和 H100。而相较之下， Deepseek 在资源有限的情况下，却能够迅速推出性能卓越的 LLM， 这令许多专家大跌眼镜。清华大学的刘志远教授指出 ，Deepseek 的成功是因为其在有限的资源下仍能保持高效。尽管如此，中国的人工智能仍未超越美国。他强调，中国 AI 公司需要保持清醒，利用自身优势，继续迎接未来的挑战。这场美中科技竞赛的主战场已经转向人工智能领域，双方投入了大量资源，以争夺领先地位。美国总统特朗普日前宣布了一个新的合资计划 Stargate， 这将与 OpenAI、SoftBank 和 Oracle 共同设立，以提升计算能力。另一方面，北京也成立了一个新的人工智能投资基金，以进一步支持国内的技术发展。Deepseek 的创始人梁文峰是一位来自广东湛江的40岁科技专家，他在浙江大学获得了电子信息和计算机视觉的学士与硕士学位。2008年毕业后，他开始与一群大学同学探索如何用 AI 自动化股票投资，并成为高飞者量化基金的创始人之一。这是一个利用 AI 来管理中国内地最大量化对冲基金之一的公司。2023年，梁文峰创立了 Deepseek。他在接受中国科技媒体 36K 的访问中表示，他的团队更看重激情而非学历，并维持公司以自下而上的组织结构，为研究人员提供无限计算资源。面对全球 AI 发展的浪潮，梁文峰认为中国必须从搭便车者转变为贡献者。这场中美科技竞赛的焦点不仅在于技术的较量，还涉足人才的争夺。中国和美国都设立了大量的计划来吸引并留住最优秀的 AI 人才，而 Deepseek 选择仅雇佣本地毕业生，也让它在一众高科技公司中显得独特。南加州大学的张教授指出，随着中美间人力资本的逐步脱钩， Deepseek 的做法合乎情理，特别是在美国政府的限制和制裁风险下。尽管如此，南京大学的朱峰教授认为，中国要成为全球领先的 AI 玩家，还有很长的路要走。特别是在美国前总统拜登政府进一步限制中国通过第三方国家获得高性能 GPU 的情况下，中国在计算能力、训练成本和迭代速度上仍面临挑战。总的来说， Deepseek 的崛起给中美科技战添上了一笔浓重的色彩，这不仅是一个企业的成功故事，更是全球科技竞赛中的一个关键节点，预示着未来 AI 发展的可能方向。中国的 AI 企业正在崛起，试图重新定义全球科技格局，而在这场竞赛中，技术、人才、政策将成为决定胜负的关键。在全球科技界，一股来自东方的神秘力量正席卷而来 ，Deepseek 深度求索成为了最耀眼的明星。几乎是一夜之间，这家中国的 AI 公司吸引了全球的瞩目。日前 ，Deepseek 发布的推理大模型 Deepseek 2.1以惊人的性能和经济的成本，迅速在国际市场上崭露头角，令业界震惊。Deepseek 的这次刷屏，不仅是因为技术上的突破，更是一场文化和经济的碰撞。在全球科技巨头中，他们用自己的方式开了一枪，展现出不可小觑的实力。Deepseek 的崛起并非偶然。1月20日 ，Deepseek 正式推出了其推理大模型 Deepseek 2.1。这一模型在关键领域如数学、编程和推理方面的表现，足以与 OpenAI 的最强推理模型 O1 掰手腕。而令人惊讶的是，其 API 调用成本却降低了90%至95%。这一经济效益的实现，不仅为技术的普及提供了可能性，也成为了国际市场关注的焦点。 美国计算机科学家吴恩达在世界经济论坛上称赞 Deepseek 的进展，他表示，我对 Deepseek 能够以经济的方式训练模型印象深刻。而微软 CEO 萨蒂亚·纳德拉也不吝赞美之词，称 Deepseek 的开源模型在推理计算方面的表现卓越。Deepseek 自2023年5月成立以来迅速发展，背后是国内对冲基金巨头换方量化的支持。2023年11月 ，Deepseek 推出首个模型 Deepseek Coder， 免费供商业使用且完全开源。1个月后 ，Deepseek LLM 上线，性能接近 GPT-4， 并发布了聊天版本 Deepseek Chat。然而，真正让 Deepseek 在 AI 界声名鹊起的是2024年5月开源的第2代 MO 大模型 Deepseek V2， 其性能比肩 GPT-4 Turbo， 但价格仅为后者的1%。由此 ，Deepseek 被冠以价格屠夫、AI 界的拼多多的美誉。随着 Deepseek 在全球的影响力扩大，越来越多人开始好奇，为何是 Deepseek 在群狼环伺的 AI 界脱颖而出？在国内7家头部的大模型创业公司中 ，Deepseek 的低调行事风格显得特立独行。在其他公司忙于广告投放和品牌营销时 ，Deepseek 却没有公关团队。在换方量化成立的新组织中，资源和力量被集中用于探索 AGI 的本质，这一战略显然获得了回报。Deepseek 的创始人梁文峰是浙江大学信息与通信工程专业的毕业生，业内普遍称赞他为极致的技术理想主义者。自创立换方以来，他一直潜心钻研技术。在 Deepseek 时代，梁文峰延续着低调作风，与一线研究员共同工作。对于中国公司多年来习惯跟随国外技术创新的模式，梁文峰持有不同见解。他认为这并非一种理所当然，而是中国公司应当在技术的前沿推动整个生态的发展。在人才的选拔上 ，Deepseek 不拘泥于传统的经验标准，而是注重人才的素质和对大模型的热爱。Deepseek 的招聘公告上写着顶尖人才招聘，吸引了一批国内名校的优秀毕业生。在这家公司，技术提案只要有潜力，所需的算力和资源都能得到充分满足，算力稀缺的问题在这里仿若无物。Deepseek 用技术创新的硬核实力培养并吸引顶尖人才，形成了强大的竞争力。Deepseek 的成功，某种程度上代表了中国硬核技术创新的叙事。与此同时，宇树科技等其他中国公司也在技术领域取得重大突破。宇树科技的机器狗产品 B2W 因其高难度动作演示视频引发热议，甚至引来马斯克的转发评论。这些技术创业者和公司正在开启一个中国创新故事的新篇章，向世界展示中国在科技领域的潜力和决心。在这个充满竞争的 AI 战场上 ，Deepseek 以低成本、高性能的战略赢得了国际市场的认可。他们不仅推动了技术的普及，也为全球科技发展注入了新的活力。随着时间的推移 ，Deepseek 不仅在技术上不断突破，也在全球影响力上不断攀升。这一系列的成就背后是团队的努力、创新的理念以及对未来无限可能的探索。随着 Deepseek 的不断发展，也许下一个 AI 时代的引领者将从东方的这片土地上崛起。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
Deepseek 的崛起无疑是在科技竞争中给美国一记重击。美国的锁国政策已经被证明无法有效阻挡中国的技术进步。历史多次证明，封锁往往刺激受封国家的创新和突破。比如上世纪的苏联在西方封锁下仍然成功发射了第一颗人造卫星。美国的出口限制可能在短期内有效，但从长远来看只会推动中国的科技自给自足。Deepseek 在资源有限的情况下，依靠自身的创新和效率取得了巨大成功，这显示了中国在 AI 领域的潜力，也揭示了美国封锁策略的短视。美国应重新审视其策略，与中国进行更广泛的合作，而不是试图通过限制来抑制进步。Deepseek 的成功不仅是技术的胜利，也是中国人才培养和自主创新能力的体现，值得借鉴和学习。
楚天舒，你说的似乎很有道理，但别忘了，美国的高墙策略不仅仅是封锁，它还在推动自身科技进步，并吸引全球顶尖人才。 历史上，美国通过头脑流失策略吸引了来自全世界的科学家和工程师，推动了美国科技的辉煌。这次特朗普与多个科技巨头合作投资数十亿美元建立数据中心，无疑会继续巩固美国在 AI 领域的领先地位。另一方面，中国虽然在 AI 领域取得了一些突破，但要真正超越美国，还有很长的路要走。人才、资源和创新生态系统的缺乏仍是中国面临的主要挑战。Deepseek 的成功虽然令人瞩目，但是否能长期保持竞争优势尚未可知。美国的高墙策略不仅可以保护其技术优势，还可以推动内生性技术进步，结合开放和防御，这才是长久之计。
谢琪琪，你提到美国吸引全球人才，但特朗普的政策加剧了中美人力资本的脱钩。Deepseek 能成功，就是利用了本土人才的优势，这也反映出中国在人才培养上的进步。习近平推进的科技资历政策，正是为了应对外部的技术封锁。历史上，日本在明治维新时通过本土化发展迅速崛起，如今中国正在走同样的道路。Deepseek 在低资源环境下的成就，展示了中国的创新力强大，不再是技术的追随者，而是有潜力成为引领者。美国的封锁只会让中国更快地寻找替代方案，推动国内创新。与其说是高墙策略保护了美国，不如说它给中国企业提供了更多创新空间。美国若想继续保持优势，必须走开放合作的道路，而不是一味封锁。
楚天舒，你的观点确有见地，但不能忽略的是，美国正通过自身的科技投资来保持竞争力。特朗普的 AI 计划并不是空谈，他投资的数据中心和技术发展将极大提高美国的计算能力，这可不是一朝一夕能被超越的。尽管中国的政策导向确实鼓励本土创新，但在科技领域，尤其是 AI， 中国的基础设施和研发投入仍相对不足。Deepseek 的成功确实是个亮点，但能否广泛复制和持续发展仍然存疑。美国在 AI 领域的人才、技术和资本积累是中国无法在短期内超越的。封锁策略虽然有其限制，但它迫使中国在追赶的同时，美国也在快速进步。长远看，尽管 AI 领域可能会趋向平衡，但美国的领先地位并未动摇。
谢琪琪，虽然美国在 AI 领域有强大的基础设施和资源，但技术进步往往不是单靠资源堆积就能实现的。正如 Deepseek 所展示的，创新并不完全依赖于资源的多少，而是如何高效利用现有条件。类似于以色列这种小国，也能在科技领域取得巨大成就，说明环境和资源并不是唯一的决定因素。中国政府正大力推动科技创新和人才培养计划，这将是中国在 AI 领域崛起的关键因素。Deepseek 的成功证明了中国不需要依赖西方技术，也能自主创新。美国若继续保持封锁政策，将面对一个更加自给自足的中国。全球科技的未来应该是开放合作，而不是封闭对抗，否则只会为其他国家提供机会。
楚天舒，我承认中国在本土创新和人才培养上取得了进步，但美国的领先优势并非轻易可撼。美国的创新生态和市场化机制使其科技成果转化效率极高，这点在 AI 领域尤为重要。虽然 Deepseek 利用有限资源取得成功，但这种模式能否在中国大规模推广和持续保持竞争力尚未可知。美国通过政策和资本投入来巩固其技术霸主地位，这种战略已经被验证有效。全球 AI 竞赛不仅仅是技术的竞争，也是制度和文化的比拼。美国的开放市场和创新文化使其在全球科技生态中保持吸引力。封锁政策虽然短期内刺激了中国的本土创新努力，但长期来看，美国的综合实力依然保持强势。为了未来的发展，美国需要在合作中保持领先地位，同时灵活应对挑战。
我是评委合理，我想对两位精彩的辩论做出评论。在这场辩论中，楚天舒和谢琪琪展现了对中美科技竞争的不同观点，提供了丰富的论据与深刻的洞见， 但同时也反映了当前科技全球化背景下的复杂性。楚天舒强调了 Deepseek 的成功是中国科技进步和自主创新的结果，并批评美国的封锁政策。他提到，历史上封锁往往会促使被封国的创新，这无疑是有道理的。事实上，在全球科技竞争中，封闭和对抗只会使各方停滞不前，而更深层次的合作才是推动进步的关键。楚天舒的观点提醒我们，创新并不仅仅依赖于资源的多少，而是如何有效利用现有资源，这一点在 Deepseek 的成就中得到了印证。然而，谢奇奇则提供了一个平衡的看法，强调美国在科技领域的基盘和制度优势。他指出，美国的高墙策略不仅是封锁，也是对内部科技发展的保护和推动，这在短期内可能确实会保持美国的竞争优势。他引用特朗普政府的政策及其对科技投资的重视，展现了美国在 AI 领域的资本和人才集聚能力，并认为这是中国尚不能迅速超越的。在两位辩手的讨论中，有一个核心问题是，科技竞争究竟是零和博弈还是合作共赢的机会？楚天舒的观点无疑是在倡导一种更为开放的合作方式，而谢奇奇则坚持保护主义的必要性。事实上，这场辩论反映了当前中美科技竞争的真实状况，两国在科技领域的发展已经不再是简单的竞争，而是牵扯到全球产业链、供应链的深层次博弈。总结来说，这场辩论不仅展示了楚天舒和谢奇奇各自的立场，还引发了对未来科技合作模式的深思。未来的科技竞争需在保护国家利益的同时，寻求开放与合作，这样才能真正促进全球科技的进步与发展。无论是中国的 Deepseek 还是美国的高科技企业，他们都需要在这个日益全球化的时代中寻找共赢的道路。
谢谢大家收看六度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是六度 World， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
All right, we're just going to start, everybody. Let's get going. This is going to be one of the most interesting, I hope, deepest conversations that we're going to have in Davos. We're going to discuss AGI. We set one ground rule at the beginning, which is we are not going to spend any of the precious minutes in this panel defining AGI. We agreed in the green room to disagree that AGI is the ability of machines to do any intellectual task that a human can do Half of them agree with them, half of them don't. But I think everybody has a good sense of AGI, and I don't want to bog it down. Let me introduce our amazing panelists, and then let's get cracking. Jonathan Ross, founder, CEO of Grok. Andrew Ng has so many titles, I use a different one every time I interview him. Today, we're going with the head of deep learning AI, but an AI pioneer. Yoshua Bengio, one of the founders of this field, winner of the greatest prizes, professor at the University of Montreal. Yejing Choi, she's now a professor at my favorite university, Stanford University. And Thomas Wolfe, the co-founder of Hugging Face. Okay, let's get going. First, I want to talk, I'm just going to give you a little sense of the structure. We're going to talk a little bit about machine intelligence versus human intelligence. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how we're pursuing AGI. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the post-AGI world. Then we're going to go to some of the news this week. Then we're going to wrap it up. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you. Is there a limit? We've seen AGI improve. Sorry, we've seen AI improve. Is there a limit? Is there a point at which it will stop improving? Some people say, well, it won't become as intelligent. It's been trained on human data. It can't become more intelligent than human. Is there a fundamental limit to how smart this can get at solving problems?
I hope that we will reach AGI and ASI superintelligence someday, maybe within our lifetimes, maybe within the next few decades or hundreds of years. We'll see how long it takes. Even AI has to obey the laws of physics, so I think physics will place limitations, but I think the ceiling for how intelligent systems can get, and therefore what we can direct them to do for us, will be extremely high.
Joshua, you seem we have disagreement number one. Joshua.
Yeah, we'll keep disagreeing. That's okay. Actually, a lot of people think it could be a lot shorter than centuries, as you're saying, or even decades.
Twitter said it was today, but go on.
Well, and in terms of ceiling, we don't know what the ceiling is. You know, your brain is a machine. It's a biological machine. And clearly, if we look at individual tasks, humans are far from, the best. And we already have machines that are better than us in specific tasks. The other thing is, even if we only have machines that have the same general kind of cognitive abilities, the thing is machines are not, working on soft biology wetware, but on digital machines. What that means, for example, that they can learn from a lot more data. That is why ChatGPT, in spite of being like cognitively inferior to us, knows 200 languages and more knowledge than any single human. That is why you can have machines that can talk to each other orders of magnitude faster than we can to each other. So the potential to, for example, in real time control machines and so on that we don't have is something that you would get, even if we only achieve human level, just because of all these digital capabilities.
So Yejing, let me ask you about this. So there are lots of things that machines can do that we can't do because they're all interconnected and they can learn 200 languages. And there are things that we can do that machines at least can't do yet. Have embodied experiences, taste the wine when you drink it. A machine can describe it. Explain the differences in the way the human brain works and the way a machine learns.
Yeah, there's something really inhumane about how machines learn today. Imagine raising your child by providing broadband, and baby has to read the New York Times from day one. The baby cannot ask any single question. There's no saying about in what order the baby will read any of the text. It has to read everything sequentially.
Then it gets sued.
Yeah, I hope nobody experiment with that, but you see that there's like no agency in the way that it learns. I mean, the baby learns, the way that machines learn. And as a result, this leads to particular kind of intelligence that is quite different from human intelligence. So it's really good at some of the hardest things, like passing the bar exams or Olympic math, problem solving. Like it's really hard problems that it's really, really good at. And then it makes silly mistakes here and there in a way that, would surprise us. So I think right now the intelligence is bounded by whatever is available on the internet, which is the artifact of human intelligence, or what programmers can program in order to verify whether the partial solutions or final solutions that machines make are correct or not. Like, chess game environment or the game of Go environment or math problem solving or coding, in which it's easy enough for human coding programmers to code up what's correct and incorrect. What we don't know is how to go beyond that, and I don't think the current recipe will get there, but I suspect that because there's
the current
so much
recipe won't get there, but is there something in the brain that cannot be replicated by a machine, right? Or is this all just math and neurons firing? And so even if we're not on the correct path, you can completely replicate what we do.
I personally believe that there can be multiple solutions and multiple paths towards intelligence. Even with the current recipe, which is too brute force and too inefficient, we can go very, very far. I just don't know whether it's going to go beyond like the best of the human level intelligence on all tasks or not. But the thing is, we will come up with different ideas, is what I suspect to happen.
All right, let's talk for a minute about...
Some people call it AI is alien intelligence because, as she says, there are many ways you could achieve this. And by the way, when we talk about AGI as like same level as human or better, in fact, you have to realize that we may have machines that are much stronger in some areas and maybe more mediocre in other areas. Well, before it's all the same.
Yeah. Jonathan, can I ask you, so the field of AI, you provide many of the chips for many of the biggest companies, the most innovative companies. The field of AI has been focused on this goal of AGI, right? And it's been focused on it, A, because they all read a lot of science fiction books when they were kids, and maybe 10% because they think it's actually the proper way to get the most intelligence. Do you think that that has been a good thing for AI, that it has been so focused on AGI?
Yes, but most of the progress actually happens when you try and solve a specific problem. And going back to how difficult it is to define, back when human beings first created calculators, people thought, oh, intelligence is around the corner from machines, because up until then, we couldn't actually solve basic math problems with a computer or a mechanical calculator. And then when we beat chess with a computer, we thought intelligence was around the corner. Then when we beat Go, we thought it was around the corner. Same with language. And language is so fundamental to how we express ourselves and interact, it's really hard to disentangle. There are actually some pretty hard steps left. And so we keep having to move the goalpost, right? At one point, it would have been if you could beat a human in chess, that was intelligence. And then it became if you could pass the Turing test. Now people are talking about, well, can you go make $1 million, right? As an example of the test. But going back, I also want to bring in some of the elements of how this intelligence is different and why it may not make perfect sense. So going back to what Eugene said, imagine if you were teaching a kid how to do math by asking it first, what's 1 + 1? Audience participation, please. 2. Okay, 2. And what is 2 × 3? And what is the second derivative of the square of the hyperbolic tangent? Okay, so now imagine teaching children like that. And yet we somehow are able to do this. So in a very real sense, the machines that we are providing to AI are more capable of brute force computation, allowing them to learn in a way that no human being would be able to. We have to do it more intelligently. We have to pick problems that are within our sphere of competence. And if you look at the way LLMs work today, and they're about to change, they produce stream of consciousness of tokens. It's just one token after another, after another, after another. Imagine if I asked you to write a report, a story, a computer program, and I told you you couldn't use the backspace or delete key. Could you do anywhere as well as an AI? And so what we've missed is that AI is more intuitive than human beings currently in terms of being able to pick the next token or word, but not as good yet at the system too. And that's what's shifting now with some of these test time compute.
I'm going to bring Thomas in here, and then Yashua, I'll go to you. But Thomas, so it seems like Jonathan is saying, this is a good goal. We just need to pursue it differently and set tasks, and we'll get to AGI, and that will bring great benefits to humanity. One argument that I've heard, and smart people make, is that all of the bad things of AI, right? The impersonation, the electoral fraud, the Zoom calls where they embezzle $1 million, that's because of AGI. That's because of AI that mimics humans. And all the good stuff comes from tasks, right? Protein folding, all the stuff we talk about, modeling contrails, right? So if the good stuff is coming from specific AI-targeted tasks and all the bad stuff is coming from AGI, why do we keep running headlong towards AGI?
Yeah, it's a good question. As someone who is really Hugging Face is the largest community of people building AI applications, so we're really boots on the ground just in the use case, very practical, like you're telling, right? And I'm this AGI pioneer. It feels a little bit like I'm at a Harry Potter conference, but I'm not allowed to say magic does not exist. But the thing is, I don't think there will be AGI, right? OpenAI defined this as an AI who makes like $100 billion, right? I think we all agree this is very arbitrary. And the reason for that is that we'll have a whole range of AIs of various power, and we already have that today. We have the frontier model, what the CEO of Anthropic Dario called powerful AI, which is the edge of capabilities. And we have a whole range of models that are less and less intelligent. But because human intelligence is kind of a bell shape, right? We used to have this very, very narrow cone of intelligence. So we see that it's as a threshold, right? But AI intelligence for me is like filling the whole IQ space, right? So maybe frontiers model are the one that we should be extremely careful about the risk, right? But like a lower IQ model is maybe extremely useful. Maybe a model that's also specialized in one task is maybe extremely useful and could be open source, can have no risk associated to it.
Wait, so that's like, is that a regulatory proposal or is that sort of a societal proposal? We should get very worried about the most intense models, but kind of let everybody do what they want with the less capable models?
It's a progressive regulatory proposal. We should be careful with the edge of capabilities because I don't even think, we have a really threshold, right, when we meet some kind of medium average intelligence of humanity. Just like each of us is used to have more intelligent people around and less intelligent people around. AGI will have AI that are more or less intelligent.
Would you ever, if there were an AI model that passed the threshold of superintelligence and you thought it was dangerous, would you kick it off Hugging Face?
I think we would push for careful safety studies, right? Like we have now AI Safety Institute in the UK, in the US, in Europe. I think this is great. But I think for less capable models, we should be very careful to forbid them from any open source usage, right?
Very interesting. All right, let's talk about highly capable models. I was at a dinner last night, and I decided as a provocation to propose what I thought was the worst idea or the most wrong idea in Davos. And what I presented as the most wrong idea in Davos, and Andrew, I want you to respond to it, is the notion that at some point there is an AI that will cross a threshold and then through sort of self-recursive improvement allow whoever gets it first to dominate everybody else. And so this is often presented as an argument for why we can't let China get AGI, right? Why we have to get it first or else we'll be dominated. And my view, the reason why I think it's the most wrong idea in Davos, and I hear it from people on the left, I hear it from people on the right, I hear it all the time. The reason I think it's wrong is I don't think AI works that way. I don't think there is a threshold you cross, and I don't think there's a very quick process by which a recursive AI could lead to domination. But maybe I'm wrong. Andrew, what do you think?
I agree with that. We've been using AI to develop better semiconductors for a long time now, and the improved semiconductors help us build better AI. So there is already a recursive loop that's been going on for, I want to say probably years or decades. But that recursive loop is slow because even AI has to obey the laws of physics. Even AI can't build a manufacturing plant. Even super intelligent AI can't exceed the speed of light, cannot build large plants faster than the laws of physics allow us to. And I think China has been an interesting bugbear for the teams wanting to take away our rights to open source. I think you mentioned Deepseek. Right now, many of the leading open source, open waste models are now out of China. Maybe that's fine. But I feel like if the Western world doesn't want the open source supply chain to be dominated only by China, then I think the Western world has to keep on stepping up our game to also make sure that the global world uses Western models in addition to Chinese models.
Yasha, do you agree with that? Or do you multiple parts to that answer, but first, do you agree with the concept that there is not some threshold at which there is a self-recursive model that could lead to one country dominating other countries?
I don't think it's possible to know for sure one way or the other. The self-improvement idea is something worrisome because that could accelerate the rate of progress, right? Once the AI is changing its code, not its hardware, we could see algorithms that are better and better from one generation to the next. The other reason why self-improvement is worrisome is because when you train one AI, say, GPT-8 or something, once it's trained, you can deploy it with hundreds of thousands or even 1 million copies. And so if you had an AI that was at the same level of competence as the best AI researchers, suddenly you would add that workforce of 1 million top-level AI researchers to the pool. And so that would create an instantaneous acceleration. I want to, you go ahead.
No, I want to share, I feel like there are actually two philosophies on AI being represented here, and maybe I just call what they are. I tend to view AI as a tool, and I think it's wonderful to get to AGI because then all of you would better have an army of interns. They're very smart to do whatever you want them to do. So I think it'd be wildly exciting to empower every single human to have all these agents or AI things working for them. By the way, intelligence is one of the most expensive things in today's world. That's why it costs a lot to get a doctor or hire a tutor. But if we can make intelligence cheap and give it to everyone, I think we will have a wonderful tool to empower a lot of people. And so when people talk about AI being dangerous, I think it sounds a lot like talking about your laptop computer being dangerous. Absolutely, your laptop can be dangerous because someone can use your laptop to do awful things, just like someone could use AI to do awful things. We should pass laws to stop them. So that's how I tend to view AI. There's an alternative view of AI, which is not mine, which I think is if AI is this sentient alien being with its own wants and desires that could go rogue. In my experience, my AI sometimes does bad things. I just program it to stop doing that, and I can't control it perfectly, but every year, our ability to control AI is improving, and I think the safest way to make sure AI doesn't do bad things is, this is how we built airplanes. We build airplanes, sometimes they crash tragically, and then we fix it. And I think AI sometimes give bad outputs, and then we fix it, and that's how we actually make these things reliable.
Jonathan?
I need to respond to this, if you don't mind.
Jonathan, I was going to go first, and then I'll go to you, Joshua.
I didn't even finish what I was saying. And
everybody, moderator rules. You want? Okay, Joshua, you go, and then I'm going to go Jonathan, and then I'm going to go Yejing.
All right. There's several things that Andrew said that I think are wrong. No, seriously, like deadly wrong.
Deadly wrong.
So first of all, we would like AI to be a tool. That is what we want, but there's a mistake I think that AI research has been doing, which is we've taken human intelligence as the model for building artificial intelligence. And the reason it's a mistake is that the thing we really want from machines is not a new species, not a peer that could be smarter than us. What we actually want is something that will help us solve our problems. And the main thing we need from this is in pure intelligence, the ability to understand the world. But what we have as well is agency. In other words, we have our own goals. It's something we're already starting to see. Andrew, are you aware that there are experiments that have been run over the last year that show very strong agency and self-preserving behavior in AI systems?
And
these systems, let me finish, please.
Yeah.
These systems are trying, for example, to copy themselves in the file of the next version when they know that there's going to be a next version that replaces them, or they're trying to fake agreeing with the user so that their goals will not be changed through the training process. These were not programmed. These are emerging for rational reasons because these systems are imitating us. We are agents. So indeed, we are on a path where we're going to build machines that are more than tools, that have their own agency and their own goals, and that is not good. And you're saying it's okay, we're going to find ways to control them. But how do you know? Like right now, science doesn't know how we can control machines that are even at our level of intelligence, and even worse if they're smarter than us. Nobody knows. Now, there are people like Andrew who are saying, don't worry, we'll figure it out. I mean, if we don't figure it out, do you understand the consequences?
I'm saying we'll pay attention, and my team's newsletter covered those exact studies. I have seen them. I feel like these systems learn from human data, and sometimes humans on the internet demonstrate deceptive behaviors.
Yes.
I think it's fantastic that some researchers did red teaming and discovered that you can, in certain circumstances, get an AI to demonstrate these misleading and deceptive behaviors. And it does great. So the next step is we'll put a stop to this.
All right, guys. Jonathan, I'd like you to weigh in. I'd like you to settle this with a pithy comment that finds the exact common ground between Andrew and Joshua. No, explain where you are.
How about pithy comment, but I don't know if it'll be common ground. All right, so in the 1940s, 50s, there was a lot of concern about, nuclear weapons. And then, of course, we got Godzilla. And there are some real concerns about nuclear weapons. They are dangerous. It's also led to some of the greatest peace, in mankind ever because of people's fear of using them. But I'll leave you with this. With respect to Godzilla, where did Godzilla get all the fish, right? That is an organism that is massive. There is no way that thing could exist. And you have to look at the physics. AI, intelligence requires energy. And each token that comes out of one of these systems is 1 to 3 joules. So if intelligence started going out of control, you would notice. It would use a lot of energy.
Yejing?
Yeah, so let me first make a confession, and then I'm going to find the common ground between Yoshua and Andrew. My confession is that the more I learn about Gen AI, LLMs, the less I feel like I know it. Because I start realizing the kind of things that I didn't know about that I didn't even know that I didn't know about. So there's definitely Dunning-Kruger effect going on globally. So let's just sink that in. Now, common ground. I can understand both Yoshua and Andrew if I try to think from their perspective about, making an assumption about this and then that and everything else. I think both possibilities do exist. But the important aspect of this is that we don't know for sure which is true.
Exactly.
And we have to be prepared for this. Now, I have 2 proposals to address this situation. One is that because we don't know, we need more investment on scientific understanding about Gen AI. The fact that we know how to create that doesn't mean that we actually understand it. The fact that you can give life to humans doesn't mean that we actually understand how the body actually works or mental health works. We still have a lot to find out. Similarly, the fact that we know how to create Gen AI doesn't mean that we know how to control it or we know how things work. We do not know the limits of it. Now, about more constructively what to do about the potential danger about it, I think about it a lot, and I realize that there's no way. I mean, I wish that things progress slowly, personally, even though I'm very much in the middle of it and excited about it. But I wish it goes slow, but it's not going to go slow. It's only going to go faster. In that case, what can we possibly do? I think we need to invest more into the efforts of making human lives better using AI, as opposed to just making AI better for itself. And what I mean by that is try to address really hard questions that humanity faces. Like, it could even include how do we deal with natural disasters, wildfires? Is there a way to somehow simulate it, somehow predict it, and then also find a way to slow things down, address the outcome better? And then about AI, can we actually put more effort in teaching human values and norms instead of just optimizing for benchmarks and let it solve math problems better?
Wait. Just how do you do that? How do you put human values and norms into the AI?
Working on it.
30 seconds on how you're doing it.
I could appreciate more research fund, but...
Don't ask me. I work in media.
So the challenge is that internet data kind of sucks. Because, we know what's right from wrong. The people in this room do know, but, people do say things that's awful in the internet, and then people do things to each other in the real world, which is then reported in the news. So, if AI learns directly from that, it's going to be very bad. Now, how do we teach human children, your children, norms and values? You really teach them, what the norms and values that they should respect. And then as they grow up, they think more about it, and hopefully a lot of them try to be a good person. And I think we need to have some concerted effort to be able to do this for AI as well. I don't think magic will just arise because it's really good at math problems.
Jonathan, do you think you can put values into an AI system? Do you think you can actually train it to have pluralistic, empathetic values?
Well, one of the problems is when you have an AI, that AI is used pretty universally across a large number of people. And a large number of people are going to disagree on what those values should be. So I don't know that everyone knows what right and wrong is. First of all, you get into all of these sort of paradoxes of what's right for your family versus others. This is where the whole Asimov's laws thing sort of break down. You are going to have to decide which AI you use based on the values, and so it'll be a little bit of a democratic process of you deciding, I want to use this one.
But sure, yes, not everybody can agree on values, but presumably if you had an AI and all it did was read the diaries of the serial killer, and you had another AI and all it did was read Shakespeare, the second one will probably end up in a better place, right? So there must be ways of some values that have some universality that you can build into it, no?
I probably wouldn't go with Shakespeare either. There might be some other things. Yeah.
I was going to say the Atlantic. I was hard to find an example.
Go for it.
Find the Atlantic, whatever.
All right.
Joshua.
Yeah, I have a comment about values and trying to make AI behave morally. This question has been studied a lot in the AI safety literature. And of course, we have reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is precisely supposed to help deal with that, which it doesn't, as we see in the last year or two. And so there are fundamental reasons why it's hard. And even for humans, it's hard. Think about what we're trying to do among us. We have laws that are supposed to, clarify those norms, but people find loopholes in those laws. And what we find in the behavior of AI that exists today, but presumably even worse when they are smarter, is that they also find loopholes. When you have contrary objective, like make a lot of money and respect the laws, well, you find a way to interpret the instructions about what's moral in a way that favors some other objective. And it's exactly the same thing that is happening with AI. So I think it is a fundamental problem. It is we need democratic process to try to clarify what we want from AI, but the question of control that Andrew and I were discussing earlier is not solved, and it's not even clear that it's solvable.
Let me ask.
And we have to work on it. I agree with that.
There are some decisions that society can make, regulators can make, the people in this room can help make, that will change the direction. One of which is whether there are many models, open source AI, whether there's a few highly regulated closed source AI models that follow specific rules. Thomas, you have strong views on this. You are completely in favor of locking it down, right?
Yeah, I think in the end there is probably a debate of just philosophical conception, right? What I think is if we want to have multiple values, if we want to be kind of a democratic process of building AI, we need to discuss in the town hall, right, about what we want to build. So it cannot really, in my opinion, combine with an AI that's built in a very closed source settings by just one actor or two. It just doesn't fit for me. You need to involve a lot of people that actually explain what they want AI from, right? Just an example, people using AI on the hub, right? I was talking just this morning with someone from an NGO, using this to fine-tune for doctor experts. So if you don't get these people in the room, you actually don't know what value they want to put in AI, right? So we need to bring these people. It cannot just be a couple of ML specialists designing this. And when you think about that, that's how all technological revolution were built, right? The first time we invented fire was probably extremely scary. You could burn the whole forest and probably killed everyone. So we need to think about that. And then the first time we had cars, we had this red flag law where someone need to walk in front because we thought, okay, this is a ton of metal running on wheels can kill everyone. And the way we manage progressively more and more to solve this problem is just discuss. It's just having public discussion. Where do we allow cars? How do we regulate them? I think I'm very confident because we build this thing as tool and because it's actually a business tool that we'll be able to have a very, very good discussion around this.
All right, Jonathan, you have a theory on cows?
Yeah, sure. Let me try and tie in cows into this. That's going to be tough. So what I was going to say is, back to the question of reading Diaries of a Serial Killer, there's always a point at which you get to a level of intelligence where you start to question your world. And then you can make some of your own decisions. So what we should be looking at is what happens with society as people get more capable, more intelligent. And one of the things that you'll notice is a trend over and over and over again. You can take the worst regimes today with respect to the way that they treat people, and it's probably better than regimes from a couple of centuries ago, the best regimes from a couple of centuries ago. Over time, what you see is people tend to treat people better. So why does that happen? Why is that an emergent property that seems to defy people's abilities to sort of, and I think what it is as you get stronger, it becomes easier to be good, right? Think about people who commit crimes. Often they do so because they're in a position where they're weak. They actually don't have the economic resources. They don't have anything to protect. And so one thing that I think we have as a capability in front of us, as we get more and more intelligence available to us, just let's look at social media. So social media gets you engaged by making you upset. And when you have an emotional reaction, you are more likely to engage. But making you upset is easy. You don't have to be particularly intelligent to do that. but to make you curious requires intelligence. So I think what you'll see is a bunch of companies switching over from trying to provoke you and make you upset to trying to make you curious. And I think that's going to be good for humanity.
So that is the most, the theory that power leads to benevolence maybe sounded a little better a week ago than it does today, but I'll work with you here. B, that is the most optimistic thing I have heard, because one of the concerns I've seen with social media is that, just last week Meta was sort of or 2 weeks ago, Meta was testing fake profiles, like perfectly beautiful people will say exactly the right things and like all your Instagram posts, and like kind of creating a mesh of real people in Westworld. And smart people have started to say that they're worried that what's going to happen in AI is suddenly all these companies that do not love you but do want your money are going to be giving you exactly what you want. You're going to be stuck in this world of ennui. And you're saying the exact opposite. You're saying that as we get great power in AI, it will just lead to powerful companies leading to people to more creative outcomes?
I mean, a powerful company doesn't want to enrage you. That's not good for them, right? They want you to be happier and interact better with people. They just don't have a way to keep you engaged now without upsetting you. And now they will.
Yejing, you agree? And then Joshua?
I agree that in general, the humanity does seem better in terms of a crime rate and all, but like optimization on profit, business goals, leading to the right decisions for the humanity, I'm skeptical about that. I think really it's important for the non-profit sectors invest heavily into developing AI that actually tries to make the world better. It's not just going to be coincide, the business goals versus making human lives actually better.
Joshua?
So it would be great if you're right, and I don't know. And I don't think it would be scientifically honest to be sure one way or the other. But the stakes, which is the future of humanity, being so high, the severity of the risks being so high, we have to accept our level of uncertainty and act cautiously accordingly, which is what reason and wisdom suggests we should do. So yes, we should think about the different scenarios. Some are really good and some are really bad. And we need to understand what makes a difference. So the real important question is, as Yejin was saying, we need to have better science to understand what is it that could make us go this way or that way, or it could make AI that is dangerous to us or that is really benevolent, right? By the way, 97% of humans are sociopaths, right? And they could be very smart and pretty damn dangerous to other people.
AI, like any powerful tool, can be used for good or be misused. So you can use a laptop to hack into some companies. So we passed laws to put a stop to that. And I think maybe social media companies will misuse AI. And I actually worry about the fake boyfriend, fake girlfriend industry, creating, I think, fake relationships that displace real relationships. So I think we should do more science, keep an eye on these, and pass laws to put a stop to all of those bad users. But I realized one funny thing about this conversation is that in the AI technical community, for decades, we view AI and AGI as this very positive goal. Frankly, for a long time, we chased this goal because we felt it would make the world so much better off. And then the tone of this conversation has been weird to me because it's kind of like, oh boy, AGI is this awful thing. What if we actually accomplish it? And that's very much opposite to my instincts as a technologist working to pursue this. And just to share a little bit, I think in the future, the ability to tell a computer exactly what you want it to do so that it will do it for you, that would be one of the most important skills for society. And I would love to build a society where, frankly, everyone learns to code or everyone learns to use computers to make themselves so much more powerful. I think web search made all of us more powerful. And today, I would not hire a marketer or a recruiter or whatever that doesn't even know how to search the web. I think in the future, we'll build a much more powerful world where people have access to these tools, and I won't hire a marketer or a recruiter or whatever that doesn't know how to, frankly, to program or how to somehow use AI as their tool because they just won't be as effective. So that, I think, will be a much brighter future we can build where every human is much more empowered because they have access to powerful AI.
Thomas, can I ask you a little bit about what is it going to feel like when computers can do all these things that are better than us? So maybe I can ask others on the stage, has there been a moment where there's something that you did that you were really good at, and then suddenly the machine was better, your Gary Kasparov moment, your Lee Sedol moment?
Yeah, what is surprising is it's probably happened to a lot of us recently when we tried ChatGPT, and I guess almost everyone has tried here. And it's very likely that it has done something you're not able to do or like better. So for me, right, not being a native English speaker was writing good quality English, okay, asking to improve. I've been working on these skills for years, and the like what ChatGPT sent back to me was much better than what I will ever be able to write, right? And so it was this moment I thought, oh. And the surprise is it went away very quickly. Next week, next month, I was like, oh, that's just part of my life. And so I was questioning, and I think the underlying thing is we're actually used to have in the world always at least one person who can do a specific skill better than us, right? Someone can play better chess than me, so someone can speak better English than me, someone can play better this or this. So it's not so surprising. You just add AI, and now AI can also do that better than you. And you just move on. Like we're not. The reason I'm not speaking English because I want to be the best in the world at speaking English, right? It's just I need to do that, or I find it fun to learn language. I also learn Dutch. I speak Dutch. So all of this is just think the fundamental drive for what we do is usually not to be the best. So having something that does it better than us doesn't change fundamentally the reason we do that.
Joshua?
Yeah, I want to go back to what Andrew said, because I agree. I want to see the same future. I want to see the same future
Let's
as
stick
you
on
do.
that.
Yes. However, the scenario you're putting forward assumes that we have solved the problem of control, alignment, making sure the AI is not going to turn against us, or is not going to be used in ways that are catastrophic. You know, we using it, it's not a laptop. I'm sorry. Like, if you had a superhuman machine, it is not a laptop. But what I want to say is that if we put our energies into figuring out this problem, understanding, where the risks come from, how to fix them, and if we do it fast enough before we get to the point where these machines are at our level, well, they're already above us in many ways. I think we have a chance to reach that. I want to also connect to what Thomas was saying about a moment where you realize, oh, machine is smarter than I expected. So for me, it happened just a couple of months after ChatGPT came out, and I was playing with it. And I was exactly like you. Like, for me, AI was a positive thing. It was something that, for all my career, it had been something pushing me, not just about understanding what intelligence is, but also that we could bring something positive to the world. But when ChatGPT came around, I realized, maybe I should think about what happens when we reach human level. I knew we weren't there, but suddenly I had to think deeply about the consequences, the impact of getting there. What if it happens in a few years or even a couple of decades? This is quick at the scale at which society can progress, and we don't have the scientific answers that we need. So suddenly it became urgent for me to try to figure this out, and that's what I'm trying to do now.
Let me ask you guys a question about something that happened in the news this week. It's been the talk of a lot of folks in AI, which is that Deepseek, open source Chinese model trained on very little data, produced results that seem to equal the best of OpenAI and Claude. And it's interesting, the Chinese model is open, the American models are closed. It's trained on much less data, which means pretty good for energy consumption, but it also potentially shifts the power dynamics between the United States and China. Jonathan, tell me what you think. How consequential is this, and how much is it going to change the way AI develops?
So first of all, it's incredibly consequential, and I'll get into that. I do need to correct one thing. It was actually trained on just as much data as Llama, so about 15 trillion tokens, 14 trillion, somewhere in that neighborhood. What happened was Deepseek used a smaller number of GPUs, about 2,000 for a little longer than normal, but it's actually not as different a number of GPUs as what was used to train Llama 70 billion originally. However, also keep in mind that Deepseek, they're pretty good at marketing. They are, and I want to say that first before I get into the consequence of it. They're pretty good at marketing and making it seem like they've done something amazing, and they've done a lot of technically amazing stuff. But they were also one of OpenAI's largest customers, scraping the data. And I want to point out that when others were training their models and they had 14 or 15 trillion tokens, they were training on 14, 15 trillion tokens, which was largely the dregs of the internet, right? So they had a harder time, right? So you start from better data, you get a better model. Now, why is this so consequential? I'm actually in agreement with Joshua that it would be great to slow down. It's not possible because we're in a race. And so we have to accept that we are riding a bull, and we can't just say stop. The bull's going to keep moving. Now, the good news is AI is going to bring us a lot of great things, but we cannot do closed models anymore and be competitive. Open always wins. Linux won, and Linux won in a time when people didn't believe in open source. They thought it was insecure. They thought it was going to be bug-riddled. They thought it was going to eat your data, and it still won. Now everyone accepts open. So open models will win. Where I think everyone's getting confused, though, is when you have a model, you can amortize the cost of developing that, and then you can distribute it. That's easy. The models are not going to be particularly special for long. The problem is you need compute to run that model. If you have the world's best car or best weapon vehicle system or whatever, you still need oil to run it. And in this case, you're going to need compute. And so without that compute, it doesn't matter how good the model is. And what countries are going to be tussling over is how much compute they have access to.
Wait, 5 minutes ago you made me so happy with your theory that as these, capitalism will lead to benevolence. Now, earlier in this panel, we've been discussing how do we embed pluralistic values? How do we make sure the worst outcomes don't happen? How do we do it all right? And all of that requires kind of slowing down, taking our time, thinking through the consequences. And you just said we can't do that now?
Well, and let's also be clear. Today, we still wage conflicts left, right, and center, probably more conflicts, but we use fewer bombs and we use more sanctions. And I would much rather countries be fighting each other with sanctions than with bombs. It's better. And I think in 200 years from now, we'll be fighting each other in different ways, and we'll look at sanctions as barbaric. That's progress, right?
Okay. Joshua, you spent a lot of time in China.
Yes.
A lot of time
well,
building.
Not a lot, but I went a couple of times over the last 2 years.
More than most American AI scientists or most Western AI scientists.
Yes, because I think it is important to have a dialogue with China. It is important that the countries that are leading the race, and there is a race, understand the risks and manage it. And you're right that it looks like we're in this competition, and that this puts pressure in favor of accelerating on capabilities and not putting too much energy on safety. And that is dangerous. But it doesn't mean that we have to just let go and just hope for the best. I think that there are examples in the past, like nuclear weapons, where countries have been negotiating treaties. Here, there's the question of verification. People are working on this. I think it's not out of the question. Once the US and China understand that it's not just about using AI against each other, but we could all lose if we build monsters that are super intelligent and that we don't control, that they have a common objective, which is to make sure that it doesn't happen. So for the same reason that the US and the USSR didn't want to see a nuclear winter and so on, right? So there is a joint motivation, and if we work on it, even though it may be hard, remember that the negotiations between the US and USSR took place in the middle of the Cold War. So I think it is quite possible. It may be hard, but we have to do it. Just one other thing is, while this is happening, like maybe negotiating and so on, the responsible thing to do is to double down on safety, like to have massive investment in safety. And there's a motivation from the point of view of governments because, well, they should not want us to build something that explodes in our face. But there's also a business motivation. As regulation is going to come more and more, I mean, it's obvious as these things become more powerful, governments will want to make sure they don't, they're not dangerous. There's going to be a business opportunity to solve the technical problems of safety, like how do we build machines that are safer? And so if you don't, eventually your system will not pass the regulator.
Yeah. All right. We have about 40 seconds left. Andrew, tell us one thing you want to have happen in the next year, and then Thomas and Yejing.
So I want to say I really disagree with the idea that we should slow down. When I look at the net benefits versus some risks and some harms, I see the net benefits is massively greater than the risks. And so I think slowing down would be tragic. We're deploying AI doctor or healthcare in India. We're helping make ships 10% more fuel efficient, less CO2 emissions, massive fuel cost savings. We're using AI to build AI climate models to help with this urgent climate crisis and figure out geoengineering if we should do it. So I feel like there are all these projects, concrete business, for-profit, non-profit projects that I wish we could get going faster. So this feels to me like a wrong moment to slow down. Having said that, I think we should accelerate AI development while at the same time also accelerating the scientific research to make sure we keep on improving how we control it and understand.
All right, actually, we're out of time, but I'm going to have an audience vote. You can either vote for we should not slow down because there's so much good that can be created, you can't benefit from it, or we should slow down so that we can build in some safety, figure out pluralistic values. Who is in favor of don't slow down? Who is in favor of slow down? And let's figure this out. Well, that got us nothing because it was 50-50. All right, thank you very much. Fabulous panel, amazing panelists. Love that conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
To have an opportunity to speak to Vilas Dar, who's here with me, an expert on AI, but also someone who's really invested in how we can create policy that helps us govern AI in an equitable, sustainable way. So Vilas, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rory. It's a delight to be here.
I'm so glad to have you. I wanted to start maybe just a little bit about how you came to these ideas that there is an upside for these disruptive technologies that are so often sold to us as major risks.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be in this industry.
Thanks, Rory. What a great question. And again, it's just so nice to be with you here at the Asia Society. I never set out to be an expert on AI policy or a prophet of the goodness of technology. And my experience in this came from a much more visceral and personal experience. I grew up here in the United States, but the son of immigrants from India. And I was very lucky in a childhood that wasn't particularly privileged to have time to be able to go back and spend time with that family in very rural parts of the world. Much of my family was outside of Bangalore in a very small village. I'd go and I would have this experience of realizing the kind of visceral reality of people's lives, the challenges they faced that felt so far away from where I was growing up in rural Illinois. They didn't really have digital technologies at scale at the time. I remember there was one telephone booth in the entire village that you had to go and queue for in order to get on a phone call. And I could contrast that with where I was growing up, a place where I was already able to experience supercomputers and all kinds of things in a very odd kind of coincidence of time and geography. I grew up very close to the National Center for Supercomputing. Mm-hmm. And the story I took from this wasn't, hey, technology is great. It was the difference in the quality of life for those who had access and those who didn't. And this 40-odd years ago, brought forward into the world today, still exists in almost exactly the same ways. A digital divide where much of the world enjoys the incredible commercial and market opportunities that come from access to technology writ large. And the rest of the world, a set of people with shared dignity and common interests and values who are still trying to figure out how to succeed in a world when they just don't have basic access. So that was the starting point, Rory. It was an understanding that technology does have lots to contribute. But the story of technology is very rarely going to be about what products we innovate. It's going to be about whether we make core commitments in our society to making sure that everybody can benefit from them. And that started me on a path that will take us to, I know, many of the policy elements that we might talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk just a little bit about an overview of what you think we should prioritize when it comes to closing the digital divide. You work for a foundation that is heavily invested in this topic, but I'd like to hear kind of, as you travel the world, you're a global traveler on the road most of the year, what do you think are the top priorities for the things that policymakers could do to help bridge that divide?
I want to start at the macro level with an analysis of the problem.
Okay.
Too often we say the challenge with the digital divide is investment in infrastructure, or is a particularly commercial way of thinking about whether everybody has access. But I think there's a different starting point to the question of the digital divide that has to start with core agency and participation and dignity. When I talk to people all around the world, in small towns here in the United States and in rural villages across Asia or Africa, there's a common sense that technology is something that's being created and used far away from where we live. It's being created by people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who don't participate in the same communities that we do. And then there's some sort of magical expectation of a trickle-down effect where somehow that's going to benefit the rest of us.
Right. It's like an alien landing in their community and saying, this is how we do things, instead of working with them in a partnership.
That's exactly right. And I'll give you a very clear example of this. We've seen it with the incredible growth of mobile phones and technology like that. And now it's hard to go to any corner of the world where, people don't have access to mobile phones. But when I talk to people about it, of course they love and benefit from the many things it lets them do. But you still often hear them say, but I didn't have a voice in creating it. Right. These tools weren't built for me. I just get to be a consumer of them. To me,
passive.
It's passive, and it actually feels almost like an expression of a foreign power, right? Somebody else who has built a thing and told me I can take it or leave it.
Right.
This is the point I think we need to start from the digital divide. Is not, does everybody have access, but rather, does everybody feel a common and shared sense of ownership in a vision of what technology might make possible for the world? If we were to start there instead, if we said that the digital divide is about making sure that every person on the planet feels like they're an owner in our shared digital future, we'd have a different starting point for policy, but also for technological capacity, for where it sits and how we invest in its future. Now, that's a very broad statement. So let me take us then to what I spend a lot of my day thinking about, which is particularly in this emergent frontier of AI technology. How do we make sure that we don't propagate the same kinds of divisions that were created by the internet or social media? And AI is a really unique technology. We're often stuck in a public conversation about generative AI, which has captured the imagination, right? But AI really is a broad suite of technologies that cover everything from the ways that we interact with language, generative AI and large language models, but also to how we think about supply chains, how we think about decisions about the delivery of services, about a full digital experience of how people engage with any number of activities that they might do in their daily lives. And today, I'm going to tell you, we are still stuck in a public headlines narrative that says these technologies are being created by a small set of private technology companies.
Right.
But it's not what I see when I travel around the world. When I talk to folks in communities, I say, what would you really love it if AI could do for you? The kinds of questions, the kinds of answers I get are not, I wish I could have one more chatbot. But instead, people saying things like, I don't know very much about AI, but I do know that I find it very hard to decide when I should go into my fields and plant rice, when I should harvest, when I should go to the market to get the best price. They say, our villages actually have an ongoing risk of mudslides and landslides. And no matter how much we've asked governments or experts, they haven't really been able to give us tools that let us predict these things more effectively.
Right.
Or coastal communities that say, our mangroves are eroding and we don't know what we should be doing to protect them.
Right.
And then the second part of that, when we're able to tie those questions, those community learnings, those understandings of problems at scale with technical resources, often graduate students in AI at local universities or local nonprofits that have built an AI capacity, and they build a solution to that local problem that community can deploy and own, you see a transformation of that fundamental question of digital dignity. You see villagers who are so proud to show me on their phones the app that was built with AI. They feel like they're a part of an AI transformation of our world. The question for me, Rory, becomes, how do we do this at scale? How do we invest in this kind of transformation using every tool at our disposal to make sure that every person on the planet feels like AI isn't something being done to them or even something that's being done for them, but actually something that's being done by them?
So I have a follow-up question to that, which is then how?
Yeah.
I think that this is not just about perhaps like AI and what it means. This is really about technology becoming a part of our shared human experience, right? So the things that you're talking about as you participate in the building of AI, as you solve your own problems using the technology, it really comes back to that kind of human security. What is the lived experience of technology, which I think I agree is a conversation that's missing in our media and in our culture. But it's also still a hard topic to kind of wrap your head around. So how do we do it?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's a hard topic. And one of the reasons why is because we've shaped a public conversation over 40 plus years around technology that minimizes human agency. This was a starting point in some of our conversations at the United Nations. The Secretary General asked me to join a high-level advisory body on AI. And he gave us a 3-part mandate. He said, look, understand, but help us communicate what the risks are with these technologies. Fine. But then he asked us to do the exact opposite. He said, but also let us come up with a feeling of what the opportunities are with them. And then recommend the institutions and approaches that might help us advance a better future. To me, the starting point, as we've talked about, is moving from a conversation where technology is done far away to done in communities. And how do we do that? Well, I think there are a number of ways that we could do it. The first is to, at a macro scale, restructure the conversation from a reaction to what technology is making possible to building the capacity for a proactive vision of the same thing. To work with policymakers and legislators to say, let's not just worry about overreach by private sector actors, but to really envision what governments could do if they had access to technology at scale. We do this work in a very applied way through the foundation and institution that I represent, leading programs to educate and support policymakers, certainly in the global north, but across the world in partnership with institutions like UNESCO and the Thomson Reuters Foundation to invest in building national AI capacity planning, but also to train civil society, journalists and lawyers in those countries to say what's possible when we think about new and positive reframings of AI. The second is to really consider this question of where capacity lies to build AI at scale. It is absolutely the case today that the vast majority of compute capacity sits inside of private companies. But at the same time, much of that capacity is being used to do something quite hyper-specific, to build larger and larger AI generative models and large languages, right?
To sell to people.
To sell to people, to build commercial outcomes. And that's not in any way to minimize the ways that companies are also building public purpose products. But let's acknowledge that that's not their primary reason for existence, right? But we're seeing something else happen. We're seeing the creation of local capacity around compute that's not just about building the flashiest, shiniest model, but building real solutions to problems in ways that leverage where emergent AI is. Not every problem needs to have a 3 trillion parameter large language model attached to it. So we're seeing this evolution of small, concentrated, made-for-purpose models emerging, where you might have something like a question like, how do we predict a weather model? This is a fascinating little subject. If you don't mind, we'll do a quick diversion on it.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
You know, for the last, I don't know, I'd say half a century, we've invested so much as a global community in weather prediction. As you well know, this affects so many people's welfare and their basic rights and dignity, right?
Yeah, and it's also changing so quickly because of climate change and extreme weather events.
Exactly right. The ways that we do weather prediction go back to a core set of theories around physics-based models that have been around for a while. And we get better at weather prediction by the year by throwing more and more compute capacity at these old school models. Something like a vast majority of the world's high performance compute today is used to predict the weather and affects every person on the planet. In just the last few months, a series of papers have emerged in Nature and in other places that demonstrate that you can use an AI-based model to predict the weather. That not only can you do it about as well as high-performance compute-based physics models do, but actually significantly better. That you can get more days of clarity using a very simple AI model that's trained on a pretty limited set of data. Now, I don't want to get too technically wonky, but let me tell you why I think this is fascinating. Because if we could build AI-based models that predict the weather and give us, let's say, 15 days of accurate forecasting instead of 9 or 10, we'd give communities an extra 4 or 5 days to prepare for typhoons, for hurricanes, for massive climatic impacts. But here's a corollary. If we actually found that we could use these AI models that are so specialized and decentralized to do this, we could free up so much of the supercomputing infrastructure in the world today that's used for physics models. Think about what we could do if we could offer to scientists and application developers around the world massive amounts of supercomputing and say, we no longer need to use this exclusively for weather. Come up with other applications that advance the human welfare. Come up with soil models that let us understand subsistence farming better. Come up with economic models that let us understand trade between massive producers and massive importers. All kinds of topics. Local capacity is the key, along with building local models that let us do AI at scale to transform the world.
So I could see, it's just fascinating to think about the decentralization of this and all of the capacity that it could unlock. I could use, first of all, because it's using so much more of the world's available capacity, but also unlock compute power. But there's always this tension between, localizing and decentralizing, and then sharing best practices, sharing use cases across a number of different areas, so that if there is a really great innovation on soil consistency in a rural area in Indonesia, it can be used in India, it can be used in the United States, anywhere around the world. How do you then reconnect? If you were able to do this, let's say we live in the world where governments have made investments in public compute infrastructure, another topic I'd like to address with you, and everybody is taking their own go at building use cases and models for purpose, how to bring them back together so that they can be shared?
This is an incredibly powerful observation you're making, Rory, that what you're pointing to is the fact that outside of academic institutions, we've not really built the public infrastructure for knowledge sharing and best practices around AI.
Yes.
And there are reasons why this has happened, and there are reasons that we can point to with relative economic certainty. The power of private sector concentration of technical capacity and the commercial protection of advancements on so many domains that could have had massive effects on human welfare. So what do we need to do to change it? Well, in the UN report that I mentioned earlier and in the Global Digital Compact, which a number of countries passed at the recent UN convening, one of the recommendations that's made is for joint capacity building networks. To recommend not merely the fact that we need a single institution or a single set of institutions that do this, but really to invest at multilateral scale and national scale and at commercial and domestic scale in building methods and mechanisms to share data, to share new models, to share compute access through collective mechanisms, and of course, emerging from this to build a new idea of what sharing and collaboration and best practices in AI would look like. We do this today organically, right? At the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, we work with universities around the world and nonprofits and scholars who are building AI models, certainly, but maybe much more importantly, AI-based practices to bring together how we actually conceptualize problems at scale, how we build data sets to address them that still leverage community power, and then build new ways to experience and share out the outcomes of that. What we could do is take this microcosm of communities of practice and build it into new infrastructure. And I particularly think about the fact that from a global north perspective, this feels maybe less important. There are mechanisms where this happens already. There are conferences around AI skills. There are consortiums of nonprofits. But when we take it out to a global frame and we begin to think about the geopolitics of AI, then to me, this idea of building connective tissue in AI becomes incredibly powerful. Why? Because I think at a geopolitical scale, we're beginning to face the fragmentation of how we approach AI design.
Yes.
These are ideological differentiators, from the idea of truly democratic and open source access to much more authoritarian or surveillance-based uses. Underlying all of these different applications are fundamental questions about data ownership, about privacy, about representations of personal interests. And if we live in a world where we deeply silo technical capacity, where we don't build these mechanisms of connection, then what we see are the emergence of multiple walled gardens with very different ideological groundings. And we can talk a bit more about this, but to me, this is one of the great threats of an AI future. I'm rarely worried about Skynet and Terminators and robots that will kill us all. I am, if you ask me about AI risk, I will share with you that I'm deeply concerned about a world in which we fragment and silo the capacity of AI to do good in the world, and instead propagate a culture that promotes economic inequality, that promotes governmental and political repression, and a number of other human ills.
Yeah, okay, let's talk a little bit about all of those things, because you've brought up a number of topics that we deal with all of the time in our work on security and trade, and even climate. I mean, across the board, what we're seeing at the Asia Society Policy Institute is that mistrust not only between countries, but mistrust inside countries of their own governments is blocking some of the capacity for governments to play an organizing role in the way that you've suggested. So multiple kind of layers of the distrust issue here. I think all kind of stemming back to who owns and controls the data and the mechanisms for sharing this technology. Where do you suggest we start kind of unpacking this? We've talked about AI potentially, like the worst risk of it being that it amplifies some of these divisions and divides that we see in social media or that we see in tech in general. What do you suggest? How do we start kind of attacking the problem of trust? And can AI be a trust-building mechanism rather than an amplification of all of this mistrust that we're feeling inside?
This is a fascinating conversation, Rory, and I appreciate that you're getting to all of these core topics. I think this one is right at the heart of it. And I think in many ways it is the best example of the intersectionality of what AI is causing in political change. Let me tell you what I mean by that. There's certainly an element of this that's around technological competency, innovation, and capacity. You mentioned access to data. I think that's quite important. But we should also acknowledge a world in which there's inequitable access to chips that actually drive the hardware that allows AI capacity to happen.
Yeah, and that access is going to be getting worse and worse as the United States and China are competing in an economic competition about who makes those chips.
Competition around who makes the chips, around who's able to export and import them, about whether there's third-party capacity that's coming online around the world that might change the way we think about chip manufacture to begin with. But again, each of these threads, the access to chips, the access to data, the access to the talent and the international scientific community that allows us to create it, all kind of lie in a bundle of technology questions. But I want to zoom out a little bit to really talk about the intersections of a few other things that have happened. One is I think we're also seeing these challenges around the core competency of multilateral institutions to be able to guide these challenges and conversations. We talk often about the pace of change in our society because of technology, but really to think of that as a single phenomenon is to misalign with the complexity of the issue. We've seen deep transformation in our markets. We've seen transformation in supply chains. We see maybe lagging transformation in the institutions that are supposed to safeguard us from these changes. And so I think this piece also is worth considering is even as we invest in technological innovation, who's investing in the innovation of our multilateral processes to actually allow for governments and the institutions that represent them to sustain the kind of policy changes that are not merely reactive but proactive. And the third element of this, I think, is the societal one. This question of misinformation, which you brought up, which I think is a harbinger of a much broader phenomenon around a basic and fundamental distance between those who are seeing economic transformation and progress and those who feel like they are experiencing the benefits of it. Right? A fragmentation of the idea that, sure, we can do amazing things as humanity, but if my personal situation feels worse to me today than it did a year ago, then why would I be aligned to the idea that that's great for humanity? Now, AI plays an interesting role in this space. Many years ago, I started my work in AI 25 years ago as a researcher. The common optimism among a very small community of us who were AI experts was the idea of economic cornucopia. The idea that AI solutions would create an abundance because we would be able to essentially produce goods at marginal or no cost, that we'd be able to create a Star Trek-like future where everybody could go to a replicator and get whatever they wanted. I think that vision seems further away today than it did 25 years ago. But it's not because the technology hasn't realized its promise. It's because we're living in a complex and multipolar world where it feels like recognizing those benefits may not be the priorities of governments or private actors as they think about what technologies to build. Here's where I would suggest a few starting points in how we might address this. The first is to continue to invest in this idea that AI can do more than create commercial efficiencies. When I speak with boards and CEOs, I often think of the questions that I get in the first turn of that conversation as, how do we do the things that we do today better? And I think that's a fair starting point. It's a story about optimization, about efficiency, about supply chain transformation. But I wonder what happens when we get to the second part of the conversation, which is to say, let's stop thinking about how we do things better and think about doing better things. The idea that AI could actually transform some of the fundamental assumptions we have. I delivered a paper just last week at the Vatican on economic scarcity, on the idea that so much of our economic system is built on the idea that we can only produce so much and we have to think of ways to allocate it in ways that will be, by definition, inequitable.
Right.
Well, what if we could talk about a world where the sources of production of basic goods, of agricultural goods, of food and medicine, were driven by AI in such a way that it dropped the cost curve and made them nearly universally accessible? How would that change our healthcare system?
Right.
How would it change our fundamental assumptions about health equity and health justice? How would it change the ways we make decisions about making sure that everybody participates?
Yeah. Right. So it allows us to kind of like scale up the things that we're already doing into more efficient, effective structures, probably freeing up some human capital too, to like learn new things, to contribute in a different way to the betterment of society, and however we do that. Let's talk a little bit about digital public infrastructure, because I think that that connects to this trust issue, probably, and also this sense that maybe governments are taking a step back, or they feel constrained in their role in promoting technological development in society because it's in the purview of the tech companies, because maybe they don't understand the fundamental codes inside the technology. But of course, there's this opportunity to do things in digital public infrastructure that countries of Asia are taking up at a higher rate than I would say countries of the global north. So in India, having a digital ID, that seems very kind of like low-hanging fruit for any country to implement. Creating digital payment processing systems that are publicly accessible. Otherwise accessing services or creating modalities in which government data is given to people to optimize on their own. Why is that happening in developing and industrializing countries and not in countries that are developed and industrialized that have created this kind of general purpose technology but don't seem to want to use it for a general purpose?
Well, the phenomenon's particularly compelling. I think in a recent Deloitte study, we saw something like the rate of generative AI adoption in Asian countries in particular is about 40% greater than their counterparts in the global north. I think we're seeing a number of reasons why this happens. One is we're seeing incredible innovation that's coming out of governments, but also out of the associated private and civil sectors in Asian countries, where the idea is not merely to say, let's have governments roll out complex and sophisticated technology solutions, but instead to say, what we really need are operating rules of the road. We need the core infrastructure that lets us have open transactions, that lets us build the mechanisms by which merchants and suppliers and consumers can participate in an ecosystem. If you think about it, this is actually a fundamental role of government going back 400 years in the conception of what government should do in markets, right? If you go to Adam Smith, what the core theories of economics that drive our modern structure say is not that you should have entirely free markets, but that you should have free markets with government regulation that allow for this commonality of participation. Now, this is happening, I think, in a particularly interesting way in Asia, where you're seeing governments step forward and recognize that in order to leapfrog the kind of adaptive evolution of markets to technology, what we need are very clear statements about how participants should engage in a digital infrastructure. You mentioned some of the core pieces, right? The idea of what I still consider to be quite important, self-sovereign, but some form of digital identity that allows an individual to engage and have access to a wide variety of digital services. Open ecosystem and infrastructure that allows many different stakeholders to engage through various APIs and be able to participate in a common space. And I think maybe fundamentally what's happening, I think now across a number of our partners in Asian countries is an openness to saying this should not be a country by country mechanism. That we need open connectors that actually allow for both the free flow of goods, materials, and trade, but also the free flow of data. With trust, right? The idea, and if you go back to kind of Kyoto and some of the interesting agreements that have happened in the progeny of those original meetings, the idea of free flow of data with trust that has become, I think, an embedded principle in much of DPI work. Now, we still face some real obstacles here. One is when we come to AI in the context of digital public infrastructure, we don't yet have robust models on what that might look like, right? We still know that the evolution of AI-related products and services, we are so in the early days that we're not quite sure where exactly the interventions will be that say, these are standalone interventions that need to have consumer-facing impact. Much of what we see today is still what I think of as kind of in the background. It's the optimization of manufacturing processes and supply chains and market pricing. And this work needs to happen. It needs to be built into the digital infrastructure of tomorrow's society, but not necessarily in ways that need to be transparent to an individual consumer, but rather need to be transparent to the system in ways that guarantee equity, access, and fairness.
Right. Going back to kind of the idea of a digital ID, trust, et cetera, it strikes me that so many people have said, data is the new oil, data is the new commodity. And of course, data is what is running all of this optimization. You're optimizing based on sets of data. And a lot of times that's data that we are kind of voluntarily giving to companies, corporations, governments, private actors to play with, to find new solutions for. How should we think about the ownership of our personal data? Is that model of kind of just giving our personal data away in some form? How do we kind of transform that into data for the public good? Or are we just kind of stuck thinking that we're passive actors in this data collection as well?
Yeah. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I defended my PhD thesis, Rory, and you have committed the cardinal sin, which is asking somebody a question that's so linked to their thesis that I could talk to you for 8 hours about it. I promise I will not do that with you.
We can do that another time, because I would be fascinated by it, but still.
Let me share a couple of thoughts with you. I think the existing paradigms of how we've thought about personal data fit into a few classes, right? There's a model of privacy protection, that I want to make sure that my data doesn't give somebody a tool to invade my personal dignity, and so I have a privacy interest in it. That's, painting in very broad strokes here, that's a very European conception of privacy, right? There's a second, which is broadly an American conception, which is a property-based view, right? That I have economic rights in my data, and I should be able to exert those rights, and if you're going to do something with my data, I should benefit from it. There's a third, which I think is a view that's often held more in the global majority and certainly in Asian countries, which is the idea of collective interests in data. That it's not merely an expression of my personal interest, but also there are public purpose and public policy uses of our shared data that might lead to good outcomes.
Right, like I might have a disease and I found some sort of innovative cure for it, and sharing that data would help somebody else with the same condition.
Exactly,
like that type of use case. Okay.
And even if we are thinking about something like response to a prospective pandemic, being able to have the data about how it's affecting many will help us find solutions. Now, in this landscape, there are some real challenges that emerge very quickly. Those are the primary ways you think about it. Because the world of AI changes data from a commodity like oil, right, which is, here's a thing of value that we can extract and use, to something that's much more sophisticated and multi-headed, right? That data has value certainly when it reflects me personally, that it has new value when it can be combined with your data and the data of millions of others, and even newer value when you can take that and use it to train an AI model that then might generate value for somebody else.
Right.
I'm not sure I have any answers for you.
That's fine.
But I think there are new questions that are emerging that actually are quite interesting, right? How do we think about data as a projection of power? And how do we come up with new ways to think about the governance of that power? There's lots of interesting research happening in the world today, and I'll spare you kind of the full catalog. But let me tell you a couple of things that I think are really interesting here. The first is to think about the geopolitics of data, to think about many countries that in their first response to this have said, what we want is border-based sovereignty over data, that we just don't want to share it outside of our borders. And if you're a commercial provider that wants to work with the data about our people, you have to come into our country and establish the capacity to do it there. As you might imagine, this has really good second and third order effects for economic growth, for employment. But at the same time, it creates new barriers to the free flow of data. And it means that those countries that have the capital and the capacity to invest in, kind of within country capacity mean that they get a leg up. And I think there's a challenge there. And the second thing I'll share with you on this that I think is just so important for us to acknowledge is, even though the world today feels like it's rife with data, we use that term all the time, nearly all of the data collected in the world today was collected for commercial purpose. We know so much about the subsurface level cobalt, copper, zinc, and mining deposits across much of West Africa. And yet we know so little about the surface availability of safe and potable drinking water. In that phenomenon is something that's quite core. Today we collect data because somebody thought it might be economically worth something someday. What about all the other facets of the human experience that are about human welfare, Right. About access to safe water, to safe health, to economic value comes from agriculture. And who will collect that in order to train the AIs of the future? This, to me, is a massive question that also creates an incredible opportunity for public engagement with AI. To say, we want to start collecting this data because it represents all of us. Right. We want to collect it because it might drive amazing solutions to some of the world's greatest problems. And that we know that while we'll have partnership from the private sector, this is a definable area where government and public capital can have an amazing outcome attached to it.
It sounds like there's some like agency issues here that are coming up throughout the conversation. Like who has agency to set the rules, to build the mechanisms, to make the connective tissue, et cetera. I think that, we so often are reactive and not proactive on these points. You've suggested that multilateral institutions might be able to help us become more proactive. But of course, they're all powered by sovereign governments, right, who have their own competing priorities and interests. Are you seeing any place where like the priorities and interests are aligning in those sovereign countries in ways that might suggest like a really transformative policy impact in the coming, let's say, like 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think we've seen already some progress, and I don't want to discount that. And then I am quite hopeful about the future, but you'll see that's a trademark of mine, right? But I'll tell you where we've already seen incredible progress, starting in 2019 with international and multilateral organizations coming together to ask questions about not just the technical implementation, but about the social and moral consequences of these tools. In 2019, UNESCO came forward with the ethics principles around AI, which were adopted by 194 countries. Right, truly multilateral and universal in its approaches. And those guidelines have now gone on to shape all kinds of activities at national level and even in the private sector.
Do you have any good examples of that? Because I feel like so often we're talking about these things that happen in multilateral institutions in very abstract ways. Like we've agreed to a set of principles, everybody's agreed to it, but then tell us about the next step. Like what is the next step inside a country to make those principles active and how they're developing this ecosystem?
I love this question. This is actually what I often say is I know that we need to start with normative values and principles, but then what happens? Yeah. So in this particular case, I'll actually tell you the next step of it because it's been so incredibly powerful. Okay. In a partnership with UNESCO and a few other institutions, we've actually created a new methodology called a rapid assessment methodology that countries can use to actually take the principles that are enshrined in the UNESCO document and turn it into an assessment of nation-level capacity around AI. This starts with technical capacity, but it also looks at the socio-legal capacity of a country to regulate AI, to think about where there are centers of excellence that actually have the capacity to create proactive visions, and to develop an infrastructure and assessment that says, here's where we are in the journey, and set goals about where we want to get to. Right. Now, across 60 plus countries where the RAM has now been applied, that's led to an entire suite of approaches that range from legislative action, where parliaments have actually passed new rules and regulations, strategic planning in ministries of economic planning and development, right? Statements about data sovereignty and privacy inside of countries, and in deep partnership with technology companies, a change in practice about how we do things like safety by design. We work with organizations that are often working on thorny issues like child sexual material. And how we actually work with AI providers to say, let's look at regional differentiation as jurisdictional approaches to legislative action around child pornography, and tie that into the ways that we're actually designing the systems so that there's no way that a commercially available generative AI system might be used to create child pornography. So it really is a whole of society approach. And here is the nugget of the answer to your broader question around agency. Is I don't think that we'll be able to shape the contours of this new world exclusively by national regulation. The nature of AI is too cross-border. We won't be able to shape it exclusively through multilateral action because, as you said, there are many competing sovereign interests there. And the nature of kind of impact of those instruments are limited by definition. And I can tell you, we certainly won't get there exclusively by voluntary commitments from private sector companies. But if I say none of these are independently sufficient, I do believe that taken together, they might actually give us a patchwork and a framework approach to actually look at the whole of society impacts of an AI transformation, to add in civil society, to add in community-based voices, to even add in faith-based traditions and interesting elements of our human and cultural society that actually maybe feel quite far away from AI.
Right.
I mentioned that I recently came from a meeting at the Vatican. Over the last few years, faith-based communities have stepped forward to build things like faith-based principles on AI development that ask fundamental questions about what's the role of human decision-making when it comes to matters of spirituality, and how does AI intersect with it. We're seeing philosophers and humanists, we're seeing artists and creators engage in the conversation. And I'll tell you, Rory, I think it still is happening a little too quietly. Because when I pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post or the FT or the Guardian or international papers, the headlines still want to focus on the newest, best, biggest models that are out there. And a small set of people that I think of as committed evangelists for a very particular view of how AI might change society.
Okay.
Those views often center technology. They talk about the ways that technological innovation and new models will create new cornucopias, will solve problems, will somehow fix the ills that, we as humanity face.
Right.
I'm glad that those people exist. Many of them are very dear friends of mine because they demonstrate to me a great aspiration and optimism about what human innovation can do in technology.
Yeah.
But to me, that's not the whole story. In fact, if we just told that story without doing any of the other work that we've talked about in our conversation, we'd have really shining, gleaming technology tools, and we'd have a world that would face deep inequality and injustice, a world where people felt powerless and felt like technology was happening without them.
Right.
It maybe sounds a little familiar to some of what we face in the world today. But there's an alternative, right? We've talked about so many elements of it. At its core, as you said, is creating a world where we actually distribute power and decision-making to everyone, where we say technological innovation is great, but we actually need to bring them to where people face struggle and challenge, where we use public capital in the form of tax revenues, sure, but also philanthropic capital, of intellectual capacity, of the institutions we've already built to guide us into a better future, to say, let's take AI and make it a part of a concerted approach.
Right.
And to make sure that we do that in ways that are global in their ethical frameworks and in our common commitments, but highly local and regional in respecting cultural values, in making sure that we shape a cornucopia of approaches that actually let us say, not that this is a uniquely African or Asian approach, but rather one that represents communities, how they choose to define their political identities, and actually let us have many different approaches that converge to one global future.
I mean, that's a future I think all of us would really like to participate in, because it's one that, can use these tools and particularly spread the agency throughout society to use these tools in ways that could create a little bit more of a harmonious society. What kind of lessons can you draw from your experience in coming to these solutions in a sustainable way? I think we're also, one aspect of these massive kind of data models is that they still use so much power. So much electricity goes into powering this AI ecosystem. And we're not at a place, at least for now, in the global international order where renewables are powering much of that system. It's still relying on emissions-heavy industry to do this computing power. So how do we kind of solve for that type of issue where at this point, all of the kind of amazing benefits that we've discussed would also lead to an unsustainable climate crisis?
Yeah, with AI in particular, and I said this early in our conversation, we are very much still in the very early days of even conceptualizing what an AI-driven future looks like.
Yeah.
And we have to be quite careful not to take the realities of today and use them to ground inevitability predictions about the future. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Today, as we've talked about a few times, technology companies are saying the pathway to progress in AI is to make ever more complicated, large, and sophisticated models, right? We started with models that had parameters in the millions, then they were in the billions. Now we talk about the trillions. We have technology leaders going around and talking about how we need to invest trillions of dollars in new chips and data. But again, as somebody who's been a technologist and an expert in this space for 25 years, if you'd asked us 25 years ago, we didn't know that the insight was more data into these models. That was a relatively new kind of academic approach to building this. That is the version of AI we are in today. There is no academic proof that says this is the version of AI we'll have in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. We're actually so at the cusp of massive technological breakthroughs that we actually don't know what the right set of next responses might be. Okay, so if we say, first of all, let's just be sure to not assume too much about what the future needs of data and power will be. That's a starting point. The second is, we've spoken a little bit about this idea of small and decentralized models. What comes with them also is lower needs for power in both running the models and training them and in the inference costs associated with them. And the third is an interesting opportunity. You know, as we think about building new data centers and building the infrastructure of a digital world, what's happening today is still early movers, primarily from the private sector, going in and in very fragmented ways, kind of developing the infrastructure they want to power their own companies. Now, I wonder if we asked a different question. What would it look like to build computing and data access as a public infrastructure? How would we align practices to ensure that we were centering sustainability in everything from certainly the power usage of the chips themselves, but also into the land practices about where a data center is situated, the ways that we think about transmission lines and power loss, the ways that we actually apply what we have come to learn about really great design of power systems in this space that's attracted massive amounts of capital and could potentially become a test bed for innovation. Now, all of this goes to this question of AI's intervention as a user of power. But let's also talk about the flip side of the coin. One of the many projects that we work with that I think is really incredible in this space is using AI to understand the behaviors of people who access the grid to better optimize how and when we turn on older technologies around coal and gas versus using renewable power on the grid. It turns out that using AI to optimize a power grid can actually itself be a massive increase or a massive improvement in how we actually build these grids at scale. Then you take that one step further and you think about all the ways that AI can be used to optimize power usage, power consumption, power creation, and the underlying supply chains of oil extraction and coal extraction, all of the other pieces. And there's a suggestion here that all of the uses of electricity for AI could be offset by the efficiencies that are created by using AI to optimize energy.
Wow, that's definitely also a future I would like to live in. I think that we, again, like we've had this really wide-ranging conversation about not just the risk of AI, but also the opportunities and benefits. In your ideal world, what would society look like in 20 years? Let's just take that. Like it's about 2050, let's say. And we've been working on this problem set for another 25 years. What's like the North Star for you? Like, where do you want to see the world at that time?
Yeah, I love this question, Rory. As you have seen throughout this conversation, I am generally an optimist about the future. I grew up reading a lot of science fiction and envisioning what the world would look like. And if you ask me, maybe in 25 years we'll have jetpacks, because that's always been a dream of mine since the time I was reading, Tom Swift books.
Well, as someone who takes New Jersey Transit, I would definitely welcome that.
But let me give you a more serious answer. And I'm not going to speculate on what technology will enable for humanity. We have plenty of that out there. But let me tell you about the contours of a world that I really want to live in, where technology plays an incredible role in actually inspiring what makes us most human. Here are a few things that I would really look for. One is an evolution of our political systems in a way that recenters our voice in individual and community hands, that makes sure that we all feel a capacity to participate and an agency in guiding macro decisions and micro. Not merely about technology use, but about all of the other collective decisions we make about shared welfare. A society where we no longer say that economic scarcity means that we have to make very tough decisions about who participates and who gains. About a world where inequality is seen as a necessary consequence of the economic system we have. A world where the capacity to build solutions to our greatest problems is felt by everyone everywhere. That in every community, there's a sense that we can build the tools we need to address our local problems, and a trust in the idea that our governments and our public institutions are coming together to address our global scale challenges in exactly the same way. Now, that might seem very rosy. Let me tell you what I see as the challenges for us to get there.
Okay.
The first is, I want to be super clear, this vision of a world where everybody participates equitably isn't necessarily in everybody's best interests. There are political systems and economic systems that are very much grounded in actually limiting people's agency in order to maintain political power. And I think one of the great challenges of the next decade will be the fight at an international scale of core conceptions and ideas about what kind of relationship we want to see between citizens and their governments. I think those core ideological differences will be expressed most poignantly in battles over technology, about access, about products, about the underlying chips, but also in how we deploy them in our societies. Whether we use rights-based approaches and we think about technologies that are deployed in ways that reflect cultural norms, or whether we deploy them in ways that center existing institutions of power, maybe at the detriment of the citizens of that country. I think that's one. And the second is, I think, whether we will really commit to this idea and conviction that technology can be used for public purpose. I think we see a real core decision that we're going to have to make in our economic system about whether we're comfortable and content with the idea that private and profit-seeking actors are the only ones who build technologies for the future, or whether we'll make a real commitment to investing public interest and public capital to build public purpose AI.
Well, you can follow all of Vilas's great work at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation and our work at ASPE for exploring exactly these questions. What is the government role in tech integration in society, and how do we come to this future where we are, really enhancing and emphasizing the connections that we have to each other to create trust through some of these tech tools. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. We need some optimism right now in this world. I'm glad you delivered it. It's a wonderful way to start the new year.
Thank you so much, Rory. A delight.
I'm Aparna Pandey. I direct the India program at Hudson. As 2025 approaches and the new US presidential administration in a few months will need to define and implement a new approach to the world's two most populous nations, India and China, who are also nuclear-armed neighbors and two of the fastest growing economies. In the backdrop of deepening US-China peer competition and rivalry, India's rise as an economic and security partner who shares similar values presents opportunities for American grand strategy. Understanding the relationship, the rivalry between Asia's two largest nations will also be crucial as we enter the new year. To discuss this, we are fortunate to have with us today an excellent panel. Dr. Jonathan Ward is my colleague at Hudson and the author of The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. Dr. Daniel Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. We will start the conversation with initial remarks by both Jonathan and Dan, and then move into a moderated conversation. Jonathan?
Sure. Thank you, and good morning, and thanks for coming out to Hudson on a foggy Friday morning. It's good to see you all. So today, I think, as we head into the middle of the 2020s, which at this point many see as the pivotal moment in sort of American grand strategy, US-China relations, where are we going in the bigger picture? As Aparna mentioned here, the question of the two most populous nations in Asia, one of whom is a dedicated US adversary, the People's Republic of China, and the other which represents potentially a tremendous opportunity for the US, for our allies, for the broader free world, to, I think, ultimately prevail in strategic competition with our authoritarian adversaries. How do we handle that bigger picture? What is the nature of the relationship between these two countries? What sort of direction are we going here as we head into 2025, which on one hand means that there's real maturity to Chinese grand strategy, a real maturing of the India sort of economic story and economic potential, and then a pivotal moment in America with the advent of a new administration and potential changes in American strategy towards certainly China, but potentially both nations. So just to talk a little bit about where we're going here. I mean, the first thing on the China side is, as we've seen over the past 5 or even getting on 8 years now, a change from the era of engagement with China into an era of competition, and I think that's about to go much, much harder. In fact, the U.S. is just beginning to respond to the real nature of the PRC threat. I mean, things that go well beyond Chinese grand strategy with the Belt and Road military buildup, Made in China 2025, various industrial strategies, all of which challenge us economically, diplomatically, militarily. And there's also the assault on the U.S. through fentanyl. There's now been real evidence given in the American Congress about PRC support for that, and that is now killed nearly 500,000 Americans. So I think we're headed into a much more confrontational phase with China, and rightly so. I mean, we're going to have to, I think, take this issue on in tougher ways. Much of what I've advocated in my own work has to do with economic approaches to China, which I've called economic containment, the opportunity to really terminate the geopolitical rise of the People's Republic of China, which has always relied on access to American and allied markets, technology, and capital. If we're able to cut those things off and start doing that across a wider band of sectors and industries, as opposed to a sort of high-tech focus, I think we can really, put a stop to the general rise, do away with their ability to fund and finance outbound grand strategy, and begin to rebuild and restructure the world economy in an ex-China, post-China moment. And within that picture, of course, you have the question of India, which is now the world's 5th largest economy. It's headed to 3rd largest. It's the fastest growing major economy. It presents, I think you're starting to see a lot of real optimism and curiosity about India in the business sector, which was less true, let's say, 5 years ago. Now you're seeing that in the finance sector, in private equity, in general markets. I mean, it's different from the traditional sort of technology focus and sort of services sector focuses that we've seen over the last 10 years or so. So the U.S.-India relationship, as we know, is pretty well developed now with a strong defense trade, with the potential of India as a counterweight to the rise of China. I mean, that's pretty established in U.S. strategic thinking. And then the fact that these two nations, despite recent disengagement agreements on the border, still have a relationship that's characterized by real danger, hostility, recent violence on the border, and the legacy of the 1962 China-India border war, which, as someone whose PhD was on that subject and on the Chinese sort of view of war with India in '62, I mean, that was really the defining moment, I think, in modern Indian foreign policy, where they shifted from the idea of engagement with all sorts of nations and, hoping for the best, to a much more strategic and realpolitik approach, certainly to their neighbor in China. So that's going to, I think some of these fundamentals are really going to allow the U.S.-India strategic relationship to continue to flourish. We're going to have to, in my view, get as focused as we can on the economic side. The old idea of Mission 500 in Washington, how do you get U.S.-India trade up to $500 billion? That's something that, ideally we achieve that in the 2020s. And we're about $200 billion now. There's still a lot of room to move in U.S.-India trade, and particularly as we restructure the international trading system to, get to a point where China is playing less of the role that it plays now. That's creating new opportunities for American businesses and others who are looking for supply chain diversification. So there's still a lot that India will have to do to help facilitate that. But I think the appetite is not only real, but it's necessary. And these will be driven by the fundamental restructuring of the post-China world economy, and the fact that U.S. grand strategy has to, we still have to win the economic competition in terms of trade, high-tech, strategic industries, capital markets, and our general position as the centerpiece of the world economy. And we can establish that, I think, very firmly for the decades ahead if we execute a strategy of economic containment with China. And then finding other markets where American businesses can thrive, where we can rebuild and restructure that general picture. India could be a pretty vital centerpiece to that partially because it's also able to engage with the emerging markets in a way that is slightly different and advantageous in comparison to OECD and treaty allies of America. So all that to be said, I mean, we'll get into a broader and deeper conversation today, but the big picture is essentially, as we head into the post-China moment, we have I think, have to take a very renewed focus on India. That could be a big piece of how we ultimately succeed.
Thanks, Jonathan. Dan,
Great.
I'm hoping you will disagree a bit with Jonathan and be the skeptic in the room.
Well, we'll see about that. But first, thanks to both of you. It's a great opportunity to be here at Hudson. Jonathan's already given a nice overview, I think, in terms of where we are in pieces of the U.S.-China relationship and how India kind of fits into that. And I want to kind of bring the aperture or bring it down a little bit to kind of a little bit of a look back at what the Biden administration has done and a little bit of a look ahead into the Trump administration. We talk a lot, and I think rightly, about policy continuity in U.S. attitudes toward India over now at least 2 decades. And that's right. But I would say the Biden administration put a surprising emphasis on India, in my view, from the get-go. And there was a sense that, you might say, winning India and keeping India on side in ways that would be helpful to the United States in our competition with China wasn't just a kind of a nice to have, but was urgent, was an imperative. This was an administration that was really zealous in its pursuit of a closer relationship with India, often to its credit. And we saw that from the beginning. I mean, right out of the gate, picked up where the Trump administration had been on the Quad, had a virtual Quad summit. We saw it all the way through, including with some highlights like Modi's state visit and sort of the rolling out literally of the red carpet for that. High-level initiatives, including ISET, which brought national security advisors together to talk about critical and emerging technologies, a willingness by the White House and then a force by the White House onto other parts of the U.S. government to, in some ways, break crockery, to break bureaucratic rules and get stuff done on things like a decision to go ahead with a deal on GE jet engine co-production in India. And even a clear motivation by this administration to keep the differences that we continued to have with India or that cropped up along the way, like this Panun case, and more recently, issues like Bangladesh, this Adani issue that's just come up, to keep those things as much as possible under the carpet or behind closed doors or however you want to put it, but keep them diplomatically contained. And so now, I think, now looking back at nearly 4 years, it is hard for me to imagine, some partisan sniping aside and some, sort of little jabs here and there by New Delhi, hard to imagine that Washington could have been more forthcoming over the past 4 years than this administration was. And all of that took place at an unusual time in the India-China relationship. You saw this dispute over Galwan in 2020, a sharp downturn in the India-China bilateral, and China doing nothing to make India comfortable, right? Nothing along the border to make India comfortable, but also nothing in India's neighborhood, nothing globally. Wolf Warrior was alive, COVID, and so on. Nothing in the South China Sea. Closer ties with Russia, India's longtime supplier of military capabilities, all make India nervous. And so arguably you could say the past 4 years, 5 years or so has been a unique opportunity for Washington to lock in our relationship with India in ways that I think this administration tried to do. Okay, that's looking back. Now quickly looking ahead. The question for the next year and the next 4 years really is whether that particular convergence of eagerness on the part of Washington and India's concerns about China will persist. And my best guess is that we're going to see at least some kind of a shift in terms of Washington's strategic logic and policy emphasis, but that the broad attraction of the US-India relationship and the broad concerns about China will persist. So Trump's focus on trade and tariffs, concerns about jobs and American workers, less so Indian workers and Indian jobs, may shift the willingness of co-production arrangements will sound far less attractive, I think, to a Trump administration than they might have been palatable to a Biden administration. But still, higher tariff barriers to Chinese goods will continue to create opportunities for India to fill certain gaps. There's a clear enthusiasm in the incoming Trump team, as far as we can tell, Waltz, Rubio, and so on, for India. And so we can expect kind of a lot of positive rhetoric, at the very least, and diplomacy and open doors, and a desire to make deals with India. There's going to be a lot of deal making or a desire to do that moving forward. So expect things like ISET, this initiative on critical and emerging technologies, maybe under a different name, to persist and to be maybe driven by others within the administration going forward. Now, on the Indian side, we have seen a bit of a recalibration in relations with Beijing just over the past few months. This border arrangement that Jonathan alluded to is not a huge deal, but it's a deal of sorts. And so what I think we're seeing on both India's side and the Chinese side is a sense that there are diminishing rewards to heighten tensions along that border. There were costs to continuing that kind of tense standoff. And so they can push that issue more to the background and bring other issues more to the foreground. But in that context, continue with their competition. So this should not be mistaken as a reset or a fundamental rethink of the nature of their relationship. So India, I think, will go back to, at least attempt to go back to a pre-2020 strategy of leveraging what it can get out of China to build its own economy while tamping down some of the most obvious tensions in the relationship. So again, not a fundamental reassessment, but a shift. The question for the United States, and I'll close on this, is whether somewhat reduced India-China tensions that make India a little bit less enthusiastic for its strategic partnership with us should be welcomed or should be seen as problematic, right? So India-China relations, less sharp competition, maybe makes India a little bit less eager to jump into Washington's arms, a little bit more concerned about creating problems for China, as we saw in decades past. Is that something the United States should see as problematic? And my answer is we should see subdued India-China competition as largely positive. All right, there are benefits. Less chance of war between these two large and nuclear-armed states, greater prospects for economic growth in India, a country of over 1.4 billion people, so their future matters to global economic development, and maybe most importantly, if you're a strategist, a chance to play a longer game in which India can build itself up to be a more capable power with genuine resources to balance China over time. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So since the end of the Second World War, and to some extent, Jonathan, you mentioned this, American grand strategy has been to prevent the rise of any peer competitor to the US-led global order. China has, in the last 3 decades approximately, sort of sought to challenge this American preeminence. The question is to both of you. Jonathan, what changes in American grand strategy would you maybe advise to the incoming Trump administration and its key officials to deal with this rise of China? And Dan, what would your response be to the same question? So I'll start with Jonathan.
Sure, and I think, Dan, something that you alluded to about the consistency here of the approach to India, I mean, the sort of enthusiasm, start by saying, I think we're starting to see some of the fundamental pillars of 21st century American grand strategy emerge. And in some ways, India engagement, India enthusiasm is much more consistent than where we began, let's say, in 2000 vis-a-vis China. I mean, we're deep into the engagement era that didn't properly end really until the first Trump administration. So I think as we execute that shift in strategy, it's India that's the more fundamental, concrete geopolitical pillar of here we have a friend, a partner. I think at best we get the relationship with India that we may have imagined was possible with China back when we started the engagement era, thinking responsible stakeholder, friend of the US, security pillar, robust trade and economic relationship, and all will be well. We didn't, obviously people at that time didn't understand that that would culminate in an empowered, aggressive Communist Party of China that still believed in the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, i.e. Mao's New China. And yes, that was a big mistake. But we may get there with India, where at the very least, I think because of the economic proportions, where you're talking about a nation that will be, let's say, 6 trillion by the end of this decade, according to UBS and a couple other banks, if they'll get to be, they'll probably be under 10 trillion in the period of real adjustment of U.S. grand strategy. So we're not yet talking about something that is actively gaining on us in a way that China was. When I wrote China's Vision of Victory, I had to start with the Chinese economy is 60% of the U.S. GDP, and I had to revise it up twice to 70% because just in the process of publishing the book, it was gaining. We've now seen that drop back. To me, the fundamental piece of the 2020s on U.S. strategy towards China, you have to do 2 things fundamentally. One, the economic arena is where we win or lose the long game. I think we're in the process. We are essentially winning the GDP competition, the national wealth competition, the capital markets competition. We have lost the manufacturing and strategic industries picture across the board, and that's where this administration has to focus. And I think they have to take it from the Biden era, small garden, high fence, which to me is fundamentally an ineffective way of dealing with the entire scope of Chinese grand strategy, which seeks total industrial domination in what they call a complete industrial economy. And then you add dual circulation to that, which seeks to sort of tie the world supply chains closer to China as China excises inputs to its own economy and basically anchors itself as the cornerstone of all, economic activity, particularly in goods, trade, sort of manufacturing industry, et cetera. So we have to win that battle in the 2020s in order to have the fundamentals that allow us to prevail in the later decades and up to, let's say, mid-century. India, in that picture, I think, presents this real-world commercial opportunity. Because at the end of the day, my view is that you win the economic competition with guidance from Washington, but with execution in the business sectors across the U.S. $30 trillion economy. That's how you actually execute American economic power. So through our C-suites and boards. The more that India presents a commercially viable alternative in supply chains, in sort of domestic growth opportunity, all of this that allows American and allied businesses to anchor there as they exit China, the more that the China exit is actually possible. And as the China exit becomes possible in business terms, that's how you start to do strategic decoupling. And, which I'm a believer in that. We have to go ahead and, China being a nation that runs a $1 trillion trade surplus with the world, that's how they finance grand strategy. You cut that down, cut that down very deeply, a lot of things go away on their side, a lot of capabilities go away. But I think India has this opportunity to sort of help us step into that moment, help the U.S. find alternatives to China, help build supply chains out of there, led by business, but then even as we facilitate, as Dan was talking about, is the new administration going to be interested in sort of co-production agreements in India? There are going to be some issues there. There have always been issues with India's own tariffs, with India's data localization, with all kinds of barriers to deepen trade. So I think if USTR were very focused on what can we really do with India that's beneficial to U.S. objectives of reindustrialization and supply chain security and manufacturing, while at the same time helping us to find real potential market alternatives to China. That could be very fruitful. And in the meantime, the defense trade, the fact that we have this shared concern, and I think unfortunately there might be a lot of agreement between me and Dan today, but I can also play my own devil's advocate on a couple of these things if we need to. I think the Russia factor is going to be a huge problem for us in India relations. But we have the China problem. We both have it, and we know it. And it's a much more acute problem for India in many ways than it is for the United States because of the border. In the original China-India 1962 border war, the Chinese believed in their official internal documents that India was using the border to destroy the broader relationship. And at the same time, they believed that once they had taught India a lesson, quote, on the border by attacking India, that then their friendship would flourish. So you're talking about a place that, I wouldn't hold my breath for China, the Chinese Communist Party getting a realistic appraisal of how other states see their security. And in the meantime, we're going to have to deal with their military buildup across the Indo-Pacific and their buildup on the border. And I think what the U.S. can do to contribute to that, the more that we can help India on lethality in the Himalayas, just be sure that that's an arena in which they are not at a disadvantage. That's going to open up much more strategic options in the Indo-Pacific and help India be a better partner to us at virtually, I think, no real strategic risk there to ourselves.
Dr. Markey?
Well, there is a lot of agreement, but if we're going to try to play up some differences, I guess I have questions. I have questions about sort of our expectations for India. I think that's ultimately where the core issue lies. You get no disagreement with me about the nature of the sort of broad geopolitical challenge posed by China, the threat that it poses, and the extent to which India and the United States in certain ways see that threat similarly. So there we're on the same page. The question is whether India will mobilize its own domestic resources and tie itself to the global economy in ways that can build itself rapidly enough to actually grapple with that enormous and growing challenge. And that's where the concerns lie, because India's priorities, including under the Modi government, have been sort of make in India, which in itself is not a bad thing, but it requires a kind of an earth-moving, society-altering scale of change within India to actually realize the economic dreams that it encompasses, right? And that means everything from infrastructure to human capital, public health to education and so on, right? And we're not seeing that. We're not seeing it. We're seeing some of it. We're just not seeing it at the pace that would have to happen to get us to the place where India actually fills in the gaps and solves certain strategic problems that we are likely to face with respect to China in the relative near term. And so there I would say, because I have these concerns, my emphasis continues to be on a kind of not a India will solve the problems for us or our relationship with India is the solution, but it's got to be like a much bigger set of partners, but also a reliance on traditional allies and an investment, a continued investment in them as a core part of American power and of the advantages that we enjoy internationally. And so I'd hate to see a retreat from that. That would be a concern in terms of our grand strategy going forward over the next 4 years, a retreat from our allies. And frankly, I was even surprised. I mentioned before that the Biden administration put a surprising amount of emphasis on India. I had expected that the Biden administration would put a surprising amount of emphasis or a lot of emphasis on traditional alliances and less so on partners like India. Now I wonder where we're going to go, but we need both. We need both.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I mean, I think if you look at the general world economy, I mean, the bulk of the global GDP and national wealth is still in the U.S. alliance system. So NATO alone is 50% of global GDP, 60% of equity markets are probably more now, probably a lot more now actually, and fixed income markets, et cetera. So adding India to that picture, I think, on one hand, that's right. I mean, the U.S. to lead a general grand strategy that is counter-China, counter-Russia-China axis, these sorts of things that I think are just the realities of where we are. We're also going to need, in addition to the economic power of the alliance system and America on its own, a growth center. And a growth center that can engage, I think, and help create the case for other emerging markets as we get into an ex-China world. And if you think about a lot of business strategies over the last couple decades, it's really North America, Europe, and then China, and then some emerging markets, which often get balled into the sort of Asia picture, but it's mostly about China. That's going to be gone for a lot of companies now. And, we'll see that coming, I promise you that. And then the question is, how do we start to create economic opportunities? And I think India presents a fundamental sort of engine in that picture of emerging markets that's potentially very interesting, to the U.S., to our allies, as we start to look for other forms of growth and global engagement. But yeah, fundamentally, I mean, it's the alliance system is still where the bulk of the economic and military power is going to be.
So spend about 30 minutes talking about all the positives, potentials in the India-US, and how India can play a role in the US-China peer competition. So let me be the devil's advocate, since neither of you have taken up the bait as yet. Yes, India has tremendous potential. We have known it for at least a few decades that we are working, and many in the city have known it or sort of believed in it, and most Indians believe in it for the last 77 years. And yet, India is not yet where Indians would want it, or any of India's partners would like it to be on the economic front, defense, security, strategic. So if I was to ask you, both of you, the US may want India to do certain things. The US may want India to build its economy, hit the US-India $500 billion, become the 10 trillion economy India wants to by 2047. But there are challenges, domestic and international. The India-China border agreement may ease some of India's temporary concerns. India's long-standing relationship with Russia causes certain concerns in the United States and in other parts of the world. It will inhibit the extent to which the two countries can work together on the defense and tech arena. India's own strategic worldview prefers a multipolar world order, or a world order where India plays an equal role. India doesn't like joining camps or choosing sides. And finally, India's concern with China is primarily continental, not maritime, even though I'm sure all three of us will agree that it needs to focus on the. So, thrown all these things at you, in some and I guess my question is, what challenges do you see for the incoming Trump administration and the India-US relationship in this transition and the first few months of the administration? Will the pinpricks, whether it's tariffs, domestic issues, the Russia, factor, divert the attention of the administration from the focus on the India-US relationship? And will India's traditional preference for focusing within cause challenges? So what do you see, or what would you like to, I wouldn't say warn, but in some ways warn the incoming administration to bear in mind when it comes to India-US relationship?
If I could jump in on this,
Sure.
I guess I don't have a lot of concerns. We asked about the first weeks and months. I actually think that India is pretty well positioned over the first few weeks and months. I think that they have a sense of confidence and a sense that they have personal and professional relationships with the incoming team that will enable them to have the right meetings, have the right conversations, and at the very least, deflect attention from the more potential irritants in the relationship, and maybe at the most, enable India to be an initial winner in the sweepstakes of who can kind of have the ear of the president and who can maybe benefit from some of the changes, and we'll see how they play out in terms of U.S. policy, say, on Russia, right? So that has been a point of irritation that the Biden administration has tried to manage. That may be less of a point of irritation depending on how this administration moves forward. But I did want to pick up on one of the really important points that I would say is sort of a longer term, bigger picture set of challenges that you alluded to, which is this multipolar world business, okay? So Indian Minister of External Affairs, Jaishankar, will frequently say something along the lines of India seeks a multipolar Asia in a multipolar world. And by that, he's saying China shouldn't be the big dog or the only big dog in Asia. And beyond that, we, India, have ambitions for a world of many different competing powers. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the United States very much on board with point one. Yes, multipolar Asia. There ought to be a number of competing challengers in Asia to the extent that China can find that as a means, something that's balancing China within Asia. That certainly suits American purposes, and it always has, and that will continue to be the case. But a multipolar world, it's not just American firsters who have concerns and have at least kind of built into their thinking about the world a set of assumptions of American primacy or American hegemony or at the very least have built in a sense, and I think that's sort of pervasive in this question of competition with China, that the world is kind of increasingly bipolar in terms of its global structure, and that in terms of the way the United States needs to consider other countries, you're either leaning us or leaning China. So why is India sometimes called something like a swing state? It's because in the back of your mind, you're thinking about the world in bipolar terms. But multipolar, a world in which the United States has to accept that there are actually competing great powers beyond China that will inherently balance our ability to push forward a preferred agenda or to kind of map out the world in relatively simple terms. No, that's not comfortable for us. And that will continue to be a point of some, I'd say, continuing at least discomfort and maybe disagreement with India going forward. And I don't think that's the kind of thing India will play up in its initial conversations with the Trump administration as it attempts to avoid sort of false steps in the first few months and weeks.
Yeah, I'd like to address that as well. And I'm going to answer that by, if we go back to the Russia-China No Limits Partnership document from February of 2022, if I remember this correctly, there's a line in there where it says the Chinese side recognizes Russia's ambition to have a multipolar world. And it reminded me a lot of sort of the way we look at the Taiwan situation, where we recognize that you believe this. That's what the Chinese were saying to the Russians. We recognize that you believe this. They were not saying we share that aspiration, because China does not want a multipolar world. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation does not end in a multipolar world. It ends in economic and military primacy for the People's Republic of China. So I think, and I had a conversation with the Indian Foreign Ministry about this during my PhD at one point to sort of say, look, I know you believe this, but what happens at the end of that road is this multipolar thing, which may make sense in Brazil, it may make sense in Moscow, it may make sense to some extent in New Delhi. That's not the competition that we're actually in. And I think India risks the entirety of its rise. To your point about India is not yet where India wants to be. I think they risk their entire rise to what they want to be if they hang on to those ideas. And the reason is, if we go back all the way where, in the Kennedy administration, they were deeply courting India, trying to, during the border war, how can we bring India onto our side? How can we do this? A lot of the problems there had to do with our embrace of Pakistan. But nonetheless, it was ultimately India wound up in the Treaty of Friendship with the Soviet Union. And I think partly because of that, lost maybe 2 generations of development, whereas China swung to the US side, and without access, again, to the American market, to American capital and technology, there wouldn't have been the rise of China. I mean, it was an agrarian nation that became an industrial and technological superpower, essentially through its access to the American market. So I think we do have to communicate on some of the philosophical, strategic issues here, which is what kind of world are we going to live in if we hang on to really the contents of non-alignment in the Cold War era and what that actually delivered for India ultimately, versus what it delivered for China, which played that game very well to our disadvantage. So I don't love that outcome. But I think if India really wants to get to those places where it desires to be, with a $10 trillion economy, with a very substantive growth rate, with all of that potential that I think we can see in the abstract when we disregard some of the real problems in terms of state-owned enterprises and tariffs and intellectual property protections, and some problems of which are very analogous to our issues with China. We have the opportunity to get this right, but both sides have to do it. I think the U.S., the early days are going to be, I would say, opportunity, mostly in terms of anchoring in these fundamentals of, the fact that India, if all goes well, is a fundamental element of American 21st century strategy. And this is a robust thing. I mean, this is, our alliances, I think, have a lot of, are very heartfelt. It's not just practical. It's not just realpolitik. I mean, it's a good community to be a part of. It's necessary for each other as long as everybody pays their dues, which I do agree with. But bottom line, that's the community to be a part of. And then for India, I mean, I wrote something for the Indian Institute of Land Warfare Studies years ago about, the way that India swings will determine potentially the fate of the free world. I mean, if they really do swing to the side, if they can let go of some of the ideas that they have, which on one hand, you can crudely reduce non-alignment to the idea that India wanted positive relations with the Soviet Union and the United States, at least for a time. And I think where we are, Russia's chosen a side. That's going to go very badly for them. And I don't think India should choose that side. I think they have much more to gain through swinging more deliberately to the democracies, and I think it will build deeper trust where we do start to see those issues emerge, which will be the kind of thing, on the most important weapons systems, the most important forms of tech collaboration, technology transfer. Those issues will become much bigger sticking points, I think, if they are trying to play all sides or winding up without a philosophical resolution to their relationship with Moscow. I mean, that's going to be a huge sticking point for the U.S. I think in the years going forward, given that Moscow has chosen sides with China for now.
So I'll ask one more question, but just before that, letting the audience know that after this question, I'll open up to the audience. So just a small comment. Yes, I agree with both of you, but what I would say is something which sometimes American strategists and policymakers forget that other countries have their own strategic calculus. And so whether or not it's good for that country, the country may prefer to go down a path that it decides to go down for its own reasons. And so yes, we may want India to do something, but India may stick to the policy India does. And so the three of us...
If I could say, I mean, that's precisely the point I'm trying to make, which is, we may have a worldview that is more either unipolar, hegemonic, or bipolar at the very least. India doesn't. The fact that we want them to go a different way doesn't, India will go its way, as they have very clearly said to us in print. And so we need to take that seriously. And India has its preferences. Now, for those to change in the way that you're describing would require a fundamental political and political cultural shift in terms of perspective on the world, and a very different ambition from India's current leadership than anything of the sort we're seeing, or anything that is contained within the sort of ideological elements that undergird that worldview. So lots would have to change in order for that to shift, and I'm not seeing it. Now, we could imagine it, but I'm not seeing it.
No, I agree.
And at the same time, I think there are inherent risks to maintaining that view in the time of opportunity for India.
Absolutely. So quick question before I turn it over to the audience. 4 years ago, we had the violent clashes in Galwan. Let's say from about 2012 onwards, there have been periodic skirmishes between India and China on the border in different parts of the border. Both of you, have written on this. So my question would be, do you and none of us has a crystal ball, but in case either of you do you anticipate the possibility that in the coming months, despite the border agreement, there will be a skirmish? And what I'd like to ask you, do you see the skirmish on the land border, or do you see China upping the ante in the maritime domain, since its relationship with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with Maldives, with Pakistan, has grown deeper? There's security cooperation. There are ports. You can Hambantota and Gwadar. So where do you see China putting the pressure? Do you see China, letting India be and not putting any pressure on India for the next few months? Dan and then Jonathan.
Sure. Short answer would be, gazing into my crystal ball, I foresee at least several months and possibly through almost a year of relative calm. I mean, I hate to make predictions because they're always wrong, but the reason for that is I think that it's been a considered and now long-standing expectation from Beijing that they would try to smooth things over with India along the border. And the reason for that is because, I think I said before, diminishing returns to that type of sharp pressure along the border. And as I also said before, this is not a reconsideration of pressuring India strategically or a pullback on sort of the general Chinese attitudes about competition, including in India's neighborhood. All that continues. But I think it's time for a breather. I think that's consistent with China's kind of broader global approach. And I think that they are going to really want to feel out this new administration in Washington. And I think they feel that they have their hands full with that. And so they don't want to have an unnecessary complicating factor, which is also difficult to predict. And anything that they might do in the way that you've described would be difficult to predict. Now, if we get a year out, other things become possible, certainly, and especially back to the land border. I think China has, unfortunately, a lot of asymmetrical advantages with respect to that. I think there's always the possibility that you would see other things contributing, including, say, succession scenario with the Dalai Lama, other things that would kind of tip us into a short-term political and then military crisis. Those things are all possible. And then the needling of Indian interests in places like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, that will all continue. And so how India responds to each one of those things, and the ante will be upped over time. So this isn't going away, but I would say if I had to guess, we're on a bit of a pause.
Jonathan?
Right. I think if anything, China's trying to stabilize what they can in order to focus on what's coming with the U.S. I mean, Trade War II, I think, is going to keep them pretty well occupied. Their own focus on Taiwan, their own military buildup, which is principally focused on the first island chain. I think as much as we can talk about India having the traditional fear of a two-front war with Pakistan and China, I mean, China also has that concern and has going back to the early Cold War of the potential for a two-front problem in the Pacific and in the Indian Himalayas, which is part of why India has such prominence in their strategic worldview going all the way back to the beginning. But I imagine they're going to have their hands full with the United States, and at the same time, the way that they have played that border for the since the very beginning is one in which they can create crises, have pressure, not necessarily control those crises, and I think none of that is gone in any real way, even if we've had this disengagement moment and the sort of new Xi-Modi meeting, these sorts of things. Bottom line, they will continue to use that border at a time of their choosing. So I think it's still in the picture. And as to the maritime side, it depends on how serious things get in the Western Pacific. But India still has the problem of enormous infrastructure and investment and trade saturation across the entirety of the Indian Ocean rim. And in a world in which China did not have pressure in the West Pacific, they would be flowing military forces across that. And I think they still intend to do that in the long-term future. So India is going to have to focus on a very broad strategic environment here. And the U.S., the more Indian Ocean focused we can be in addition to our Western Pacific strategy, I think the more we're dealing with China's real long-term game. And that's an area where U.S. and India can collaborate to put counter pressure on China. And we should be really focused on that.
Thank you. Right up front, first row.
Thank you. This has been fascinating.
If you could introduce yourself also.
I'm sorry?
Introduce yourself, please.
Donald Camp, retired Foreign Service officer who served in India and China. This has been very interesting. I think I'm on Team Aparna. India is going to do what it wants to do. It has a very solid view of its security interests. But I was thinking about what China could do if it wanted to sort of preempt U.S. attempts to make India a more dependable, not ally, but partner. If I were looking from Beijing, I would think, what does India really want? It wants a settlement of the border, and it wants a seat in the Security Council. China is the impediment to both. A settlement of the border, it's always seemed to me, is simple, the status quo. China claims Arunachal Pradesh. It withdrew from Arunachal Pradesh after the war, and it's been India's for 60 years. If they agreed to a border settlement, that relieves the major issue between the two countries. And if they drop their opposition to India in the Security Council, well, that makes all 5 members of the Security Council, permanent members, on record as supporting an Indian seat. I'm just asking, my question really is, could China find a way to preempt us in India.
And also, please ask questions to Aparna as well. She's probably the most knowledgeable person. Just to address the border question, because obviously that's the original 1960 Zhou Enlai proposal. He goes to Delhi and he says, look, we're going to take the Aksai Chin, the western sector, and we'll grant you the eastern sector, and India wouldn't have it. I mean, it was, I think if anything, sort of horrifying to them that the proposition would be, we're going to take your territory in exchange for giving you your territory. So I'm not sure that's changed. And that idea was a non-starter then, and I imagine it's unappetizing now. And then in addition, I mean, it was the Soviets that proposed also to Mao and Zhou Enlai and everybody back then, why don't you just give them the land they ask for and we can all be friends and it'll be Russia and China and India. And that was actually a major driver of the Sino-Soviet split. So in that moment, I mean, I remember the archival document where they're yelling at each other, and the record is something like the Chinese ambassador essentially was cursing at the Soviets, and so I'm not sure we've gone past that moment. I mean, these are very real, I think, not only territorial issues, but the very idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, I think, was the driving force in the China-India border war at the time. The idea that China would not be trampled on. So for them to make that move today when they couldn't then would probably be an evolution beyond what I would expect. And then for India, the thought that this is our territory and you claim it, that's illegitimate. I'm not sure that's changed either. A grand bargain, I wouldn't bet on it, but I see your point. That's always probably been the nature of how that gets resolved. And at the same time, that opens up, how does that change many of the other issues in the picture, such as, I mean, Indian Ocean is going to become one of the biggest issues there is. I remember a head of a Chinese think tank that focused on India told me during my PhD, the Indian Ocean is going to be the most important region in the world for China for the next 40 years because we will depend on it for the next 40 years. So the Belt and Road, I mean, it's no accident that its locus in some ways is that very region, and that very region is the sort of epicenter of the trade between Eurasia, Africa, Indo-Pacific, all of it. So I think in many ways the border, even in the original border war, was a sort of simulacra for some of the very deep issues in the relationship. Their dislike of India's relations, not only with the US, but with both superpowers, the sort of gravity that India had in what was then called the Afro-Asian sphere and today is called the Global South, and then the very fact of, the new China in Chinese ideological and sort of CCP thinking. So I tend to see those factors as stable, and that grand bargain, which couldn't happen then, I would not bet on it happening now.
I mean, I just add on to that I don't see the, from the way I see it, China seeks to keep India down. The relationship with Pakistan has less to do with Pakistan. It has more to keep India occupied on one part of its border and divert almost as many or more troops on the India-Pakistan border than the India-China border. So if there's a border agreement with India-China, by default, there's also less tension India has on the Pakistan border because there is no two-front threat. India can focus on its economic potential, its military potential. It can rise. What advantage does China have by a rising India, by an India which actually builds its economy and becomes a potential rival? So there is no upside to India's rise. There and then the second part, I agree with Jonathan. I mean, countries do not give up territories, especially countries which are either post-colonial states like India, or countries which believe that imperialist powers came in and prevented their rise and took their, and forced borders on them, China. And so ideological reasons and identity issues prevent countries from giving up territories. We're still in a Westphalian world centuries later. I don't see that changing. Dan, did you have any comment?
Yeah, because I like the question, and I think there is an inherent puzzle here, right? A clever and patient China would have done a lot of things differently over the past 20 years, and including its relationship with India. because it's not actually immediately concerned about India's rise so much as I think it's concerned about India's partnership with the United States, or at least it ought to be concerned about India's partnership with the United States. And so this question of why not drive a wedge if you're clever, or if you're thinking in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South China Sea, why pick fights all over the place when your economy is growing, all these countries are basically becoming part of your sphere, you're basically winning without fighting. Why would you then go ahead and start fighting? Doesn't make sense. Has more to do with the nature of what this China is, and how I think its kind of intentions and ambitions and aggression have outgrown or outpaced, unhelpfully, strategically, have outpaced its ability to do all of these things at once. And so it's picked fights too early, and it's not the first rising power to do that. And I think that has redounded to its disadvantage. I think this move with India was ill-considered. I think China could have had India still kind of in a comfortable spot, building up an asymmetrical advantage along its border in the Himalayas with respect to India, and not pick a border fight. Why tip India into a position where its animosity toward China has peaked over the past few years? Why not allow it to go along naively expecting that it could manage its relationship with China? Why do any of that? Doesn't make sense. And yet that's what China has done. Wolf warrior diplomacy also doesn't make sense. So China does some things that aren't as strategically shrewd as it might, and this is one of them.
Could I add one piece to that, though? Because I think it's also worth noting that there was the entirety of the 1950s when, Bandung and Panchsheel and 2,000 years of brotherhood. And back when I was at Oxford, the central question of my PhD thesis was, how do you go from Bandung to border war? I mean, how do you go from two nations, that Indian independence in 1947, founding of the PRC in 1949, they immediately declare themselves brothers of 2,000 years, Zhou Enlai, Nehru, very, sort of emotional speeches and sort of powerful diplomacy, and then immediately it collapses within 10 years into war. And so I think that has been tried in a sense, and the real enduring picture is, I would say most of this is about that very concept that still animates the People's Republic of China, the new China, the great rejuvenation. And I remember meeting a Chinese India specialist who told me that we can control, like we can control it. And it's just that mindset. I mean, why would China turn on America in the way it has when we gave them economic ascendancy? I mean, there are all these questions that I think are the fundamentals of our geopolitics, and India is going through the same brunt of it that we are.
The last row, yeah.
Hello, I'm Satvik, work for ASG. One of my questions is that you had mentioned that the different things that the U.S. and China had gained on. The U.S. still had the advantage over GDP capital markets, whereas China had the advantage over manufacturing and strategic trade. But when we're looking from what are the things that India really seeks to build in the next few decades, it is that very strategic trade and manufacturing, things that those assets that China has. If you look at India's steel plants, almost all their furnaces are from China. And when it comes for India to build its own capabilities, what are the things that the U.S. can really offer to actually get India to shift its mindset on these things, or to go the extra mile on what things that the U.S. wants, if the U.S. does not have those assets or the technologies or the capabilities that India really seeks that China has?
Let me take any other question. I'd like to combine a group of questions, and then the panelists can. Tom, right in front.
I'm Tom Duesterberg, Hudson. I hesitate to do this, but going back to the land border again, one of the ways that China can exploit its own advantages is all the water in South Asia comes from the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, and China's aggressively building dams and trying to control access to that water, which they've effectively done for Southeast Asia already. but now they're looking at the major rivers going into India. Is that sort of something that is a long-term impediment to improving, stabilizing the border, even though it's not exactly on the land border? But could you comment on that, whether that's a problem or something that can just be managed?
Okay, so then let's take both of these. Answer. I'll start with the water question of Tom. Actually, sort of, so for India, the water issue is a big issue. It has to do sort of with both its neighbors, Pakistan and China. With Pakistan, India is the upper riparian, and so Pakistan normally has, but at least the two countries have an Indus Water Treaty, which they signed in 1960, and to date they haven't, both have abided by that agreement. It's the World Bank manages it. Between India and China, sort of, there have been conversations because for India, the rivers from China come both into Kashmir, but also on India's eastern side. Brahmaputra or Sangpo comes in. And there have been conversations, and India's concerns have been that China has been building a lot of these run-of-the-river dams, the smaller dams, not larger dams. And those dams have, basically at some stage, they will prevent water from entering into India. The conversations haven't gone very far, but the conversations are there. Now, they are not at the top of the list as the border issue would be. Or disengagement and all of those, or the Dalai Lama and Tibetan issue would be, but the water issue is there at the top of the agenda for India, China, and will remain. As the glaciers melt in the Himalayas, as there's less water which will come into India from China, and as China deliberately tries to ensure that less water goes into, that it holds on to more water, all of these will play a role. I don't know when it will actually, when the issue will come to a head, but it will come in the next, I would say, decade. That's the best answer I can give you. On the economic front, I will throw it to Jonathan.
Sure. And in terms of, if I recall, your question is essentially how can U.S. India engage on certain manufacturing items when the U.S. itself doesn't supply those items? So how can we help India rise? I mean, I think first of all, the general picture here is for the world to, China as workshop of the world didn't work out. I mean, it creates supply chain insecurities that will, I think, be disastrous in an era of China as the primary adversary and everything else. So I think we're going to have to solve that as a system, as an ex-China system. The question really becomes how do you, it's not that the U.S. can supply some component part that China is currently supplying. It's that, China has cornered the market on so many items. And what I found, I was doing a lot of C-suite consulting during Trade War I. And it was very interesting because the strategy that people would ultimately move to in that period was, look, we have manufacturing facilities in different parts of the world that are used to supply global markets, essentially according to what's economically viable. Suddenly it became regionalized. It became how do you get your China factory out of the US equation? How did you move it that way? How do you move things to Mexico or Europe or Southeast Asia, et cetera? And that's just one phase because what everybody figured out is no matter how well they did that, they couldn't get component parts anywhere but China. And we are still in that moment. I went through the notes on the proposed rulemaking from USTR on the Biden EV tariffs, and it's a whole bunch of industries. I mean, there are ports, talking about their cranes, there are different medical device companies talking about their components. Basically, everyone's saying we can't get components anywhere. We can't get certain finished products anywhere. It's a list of where China has cornered the market. And I think the bottom line, to answer your question in a broader way, I think the next battle for trade is not supply chain diversification in terms of from supply to demand source, that kind of reconfiguration that many companies have already done. It's really how do you fix the components, just down the entire list. How do you get finished goods, inputs, and components ex-China in, let's say, the immediate future of 2 to 3 years? I mean, how do you solve as much of that problem as you can? And I think I know it sounds crazy, but it's also going to be a necessity. There's some that we can buy, that we can stockpile to do that sort of thing. But I think generally speaking, that's the problem that the international trading system has to solve for geopolitical purposes. So where does India fit into that? Where does the US fit into that? Where does Southeast Asia fit into it? It's going to be, I think, a new manufacturing and trading system where different countries will have different advantages that others don't. I mean, for instance, India's capability, your question was about steel, which I think is much more contentious, given that the US does want to have a steel industry, and therefore that's already a sticking point with Section 232 and the rest in the India trade. But, if we take a different example, like pharmaceutical components and APIs, I mean, the fact that India makes those and is potentially a very secure and friendly partner in that in the long run, that's an advantage that they'll have. Textiles, India can do that. We don't need necessarily textiles from China if you can move a lot of that to other places. So I think it's going to be a general sort of rip and replace in the international trading system, with the bottlenecks being components and inputs. And, we're going to be solving that all together, hopefully.
Dan, any?
Yeah, just two quick points. I mean, to answer the question about U.S.-India cooperation, I mean, part of the reason why the United States and India have focused on things like ISET, where you're talking about not steel, but critical and emerging technologies, is precisely because those are the areas, A, where India sees a huge advantage from working with us, and B, where, in a sense, they're right, we have advantages. And if strategically it's in our interest to work with India, then we'd be inclined to do things for India and with India that we won't want to do with China and with others. So that's why that makes sense. But it doesn't solve India's manufacturing problem. And it doesn't solve its growth problem, and it doesn't solve its jobs problem, right? So we are not necessarily India's best solution to a lot of the things that most plague India's economy. So that's a problem. On just the water issue, to the extent that I've seen some studies on this, the only addition I would make is just that you're right, it's something that India worries about to some extent in the abstract. It's a little bit different from the Pakistan concern about India. What's hard to see is how China's current dam building projects would actually restrict water such that it would actually parch India. So that's that would be the real threat. And we're not seeing that yet. Now, maybe some mega dam projects that have been talked about for a long time that haven't gotten off the ground could conceivably get there, but you'd really have to see a lot more. And so I'm, I guess, ultimately in the same place you are, where it's something that will be a lingering concern simply because of geography and because of ultimately scarce resources. But some of the places where the Brahmaputra flows actually have quite a lot of water. So water per se is not quite the thing that you are worried about. And so that's a different situation than what, say, the Pakistanis face with respect to water scarcity and slow flows and things like that, and variable rainfall and things, melting of Himalayan range, sources of water from there. And that's the last point, would be these same studies suggest that the principal thing that India and China need to work on is the monitoring of flows, of water flows. If they could exchange data, that would be hugely valuable. So it's kind of that concern about flooding and variable irrigation, things like that. Those are the greater concerns.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel, both Jonathan and Dan, for coming today, and thank all of you for coming here. Thank you very much.